Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. What if Naruto was the imperfect hero everyone rejected? Part 2. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to support my channel for more fanfic like this. I hope and now let's start the fanfic. Under the weeping willows. With each step toward Lord Elrond's private office, fear seeped through Ellenmeyer's veins, and she slowed when she neared the corridor where she knew he was waiting. How angry is he, Anarel? She asked her servant, pausing at the last few feet before his office. Anarel placed a reassuring hand on the lady's shoulder, her voice gentle. Do not worry, Arwen Amin, she said softly. What he must say is only out of love for you. That did not stop the dread from paralyzing her, and she found she had no control over her legs, and they remained firmly planted to the floor. Anarel gave her a gentle push forward, frowning. His anger is not directed at only you alone, Ellenmeyer. Her head snapped as she twisted to look at her handmaiden. Who else did he wish to summon? But Anarel had not the time to answer, for Mary Sue was noticeably limping down the same corridor, pausing only when she saw Ellenmeyer standing there as well. Immediately, Ellenmeyer narrowed her eyes to glare at the girl who had her right arm in a sling as if she had broken it, but Ellenmeyer could not help but be pleased with herself at the bruised eye she had given her. She had hit Mary Sue so hard that her face now appeared lopsided, the swelling of the right side of her face purple and puffy. What are you doing here? Mary Sue demanded, trying unsuccessfully to flip her long, jet black hair out of her face with her left hand. My father wishes to see me, Ellenmeyer said flatly, scrutinizing the sling. Why do you wear such a thing? I merely gave you a scratch, not a broken arm. Mary Sue radically replaced the bitterness in her eyes to that of self-pity as she cast her gaze to her right arm. You do not know the pain I must endure, she muttered so dramatically that even Anarel rolled her eyes. I've suffered far worse, Ellenmeyer scoffed. I cannot believe that the one would be someone as pathetic as you. It makes absolutely no sense when you can hardly handle a tiny nick. Mary Sue straightened up indignantly. Well, I never, she exclaimed. You really are a jealous person to want to destroy something as beautiful as, well, as me. She gave her a nasty smirk. I'm not as stupid as you think I am. I see the way you look at Legolas, so I can only understand why you'd want to hurt me, but no matter what you do, who's going to be the one with him in the end? He's perfect, and he deserves no less than that. She looked disdainfully at Ellenmeyer the way she had when they had first seen each other in the woods, and Ellenmeyer knew better than to listen to her words, but Mary Sue had hit a nerve the moment she mentioned Legolas, and the anger that had never fully died down was again alive with fervor. You may be able to beat me down with a sword, but I assure you that you won't win in the end with Legolas. Can you honestly look at yourself, and think that he'd want you? Ellenmeyer was momentarily petrified, knowing that in her heart, she could not confidently answer yes, and Mary Sue smiled even more evilly at the hesitation on Ellenmeyer's face. It's already been prophesied, Legolas and I will be together, and if you accept it right now, then maybe your foretold broken heart will heal much sooner. I have heard enough from your blistered tongue. Anarel cried out loudly, far more furious than Ellenmeyer had ever seen her. If the lady had not yet slashed you with her sword, I would grab it myself and do the same damage. She took a threatening step toward Mary Sue, pointing her finger accusingly. You have no right to utter such words of disrespect to her, do you understand? Silence. A voice boomed just further down the hall, and Lord Elrond approached the three of them slowly, his anger so tangible, it filled the air and nearly choked them. He lowered his voice, but Ellenmeyer knew that his rage grew no less. Ellenmeyer, Mary Sue, you will both come with me to my office. And Anarel, please attend to our other guests until I have finished speaking with the both of them. Anarel bowed slightly and shot Ellenmeyer a look of apology before fleeing to follow his commands. They entered the room silently, never uttering a word, afraid to upset the Lord of Rivendell even more. He gestured for them to sit in the two chairs in front of him as he stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fiery. I have no words to express exactly how disappointed I am with the both of you, he began, keeping his voice level. You know that the peace of Middle-earth depends entirely on the cooperation between the Fellowship and the One, and with both of your childish antics, you two jeopardize the lives of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. He focused his gaze on Ellenmeyer, and she squirmed under his glare, too ashamed to look up into his face. Ellenmeyer, as my daughter and as the second captain of the guard, I relied on you to take Mary Sue under your wing as your apprentice. The day has not yet passed, and here she is before me, injured, not from training, but from the interference of your personal loathing for her. With her excellent peripheral vision, Ellenmeyer saw Mary Sue smirk merrily at the scolding. Have I taught you nothing, Ellenmeyer? Tears burned underneath her lids, but she refused to allow herself to shed her tears in Mary Sue's presence, not like that. It was killing her to hear the disappointment in his voice, knowing that she was the reason it was there in the first place. I trusted you to know better, for you have the wisdom of the many years our people are blessed with. I am sorry, Father, she managed to let out just above a whisper, but her voice was strangled, and she could say no more for fear of erupting into tears. And you, Mary Sue, he addressed, turning his steely gaze to hers so quickly she froze like a deer. I have welcomed you into my realm with open arms, and I have shown nothing less of kindness to you. Yet, you have disrespected not only my daughter, but the whole of Middle-earth. How did I do that? She gasped in disbelief in his words. I've never done anything to. Yes, you have, he cut in icily, clenching his teeth. I have it on good account that you were heard threatening to decline from this mission, which you readily accepted but yesterday, knowing that the fate of all who live in these lands lies within you. To so nonchalantly discard any thought to those who are in most need of your help is to join the Dark Lord himself in the land of Mordor. She shook her head in denial, her eyes as wide as saucers. No, Lord Elrond, she cried out piteously, I'm not evil-like. Quiet, he shouted, his eyes glowing. It is in both your destinies to see that this prophecy is fulfilled, and I will not hear another word of complaint from either of you. As I had said at the council, you will unite or you will fall. What will it be? He fell into silence as he stared at the two females, both of whom were motionless in their chairs and deep in thought. I will do what I must to save our home, father, Ellenmeyer finally whispered, and I shall put my petty aversions aside. Yeah, whatever she said, Mary Sue muttered in agreement. Now, I will hear no more of cancelled training sessions, nor will I hear of any more fights over Legolas, Elrond stated with a tone of finality. There are more important things at risk than competing for the heart of the Prince of Mirkwood. Thank the Valar that he has not yet gone crazy from the combined pressure from the mission ahead and from the rivalry between the two of you for his affections. Mary Sue turned away, hiding her burning cheeks under her long, silky hair, but Ellenmeyer looked up into her father's face with painful determination. He is not mine to have, Ellenmeyer said fiercely, a lone tear escaping down her cheek. The prophecy has written its intentions clearly, and I will do nothing to prevent it from its fulfillment. Preserving the safety of Middle-earth is more imperative to me than satisfying the wishful longings of my own heart. Elrond's stern expression slowly melted into one of compassion as he looked down at her, and the anger he had been feeling for her was slowly ebbing away. He looked to Mary Sue, and with a tone of definiteness, he declared, You are dismissed, Mary Sue, and I expect you to meet with Ellenmeyer early tomorrow morning for your training, with punctuality in mind. She nodded as she sprinted out of the room, her earlier limp now forgotten. Ellenmeyer got up unsteadily, wavering before her father embraced her hard. His familiar scent of birch trees and grass filled her nostrils, throwing her into a state of nostalgia, and she clutched to him desperately like the tiny, orphaned elf she once was. It had been years since she felt so small, so unprotected, and she wanted nothing more than to frolic back into the safety Elrond had surrounded her in the moment he adopted her as one of his own. Remorse pervaded her entire being for repaying the kind elf with nothing but displeasure at her actions. Father, I am so sorry I disappointed you, she choked out, sobbing into his shoulder. Maybe it is my human side that makes me so impulsive. Ah, Ellenmeyer, he whispered sadly, why must you detest the human blood that runs within you? Because it has made me into such a deformed elf. She cried out. You, father, are half-elven, but you are as beautiful to behold as pureblood firstborns, not only physically, but with wisdom and knowledge as well. Why is it that I was cursed with this awkward, graceless body and hideous face? I am weak, and there is not even enough strength in me to ignore even the tiniest insults from a worthless girl. I do not understand at all. You are not what you say you are, he said angrily, slightly shaking her. Do you not see that you must believe in yourself, Ellenmeyer? Care not what others, like Mary Sue, say. There is beauty within your soul, my dear, but only you can free that beauty from the restraints of insecurity that hold it buried deep inside. He sighed. You have the capability for greatness, if only you allow yourself to trust yourself. I do not know what other advice I can give to you, young one, for I cannot command your mind to believe me. Only you can do that now. He grew quiet for several moments as she quieted her sobs before speaking again. There are those who see past that visage you hide under. You mean Boromir. Her cheeks colored at the thought of him, hating herself for allowing Legolas to interfere with what had the potential to be a beautiful relationship. Yes, Elrond confirmed, clearing his throat. So you must see that there are those who look for more than a pretty face, and if Legolas cannot see that, then he deserves someone like Mary Sue. Ellenmeyer smiled softly, sadness tugging at the corners of her lips. You are right, though it hurts to hear the words spoken, she replied and sighed deeply before detaching herself from his arms. Diola ye, Ada. Thank you, father. I needed to be scolded. My mind has traveled back into its rightful place from out of the clouds. He kissed her forehead before she moved to leave. Now, my dear, go to the one who can bring you happiness, he said, his eyes lighting up when her cheeks maintained their rosy color from the earlier mention of Boromir's name. The light around her grew a bit, hovering around her head like a faint halo. As you wish, she smiled before leaving his office, and headed straight to the dining hall where she hoped he still was. Upon entering, she was attacked by Merry and Pippin, who pulled and tugged at her arms to lead her to their circular table, where, to her surprise, Sam, Frodo, and Boromir also sat. Merry and Pippin were on their feet before I could even react. Boromir laughed in greeting. She sat down next to him while the two hobbits argued who would sit on her other side, with Merry finally winning the battle. He smiled smugly as Pippin grumbled, seating himself on Merry's other side, next to Sam, who eyed each of them suspiciously, especially Boromir. Granted, Boromir was acting strangely, his face switching from tension to laughter and back again, particularly when his eyes landed on Frodo, but Ellenmire, too, felt strange urges to glance at Frodo every now and then as the hobbits ate heartily. Ellenmire, a voice hissed so softly that only her elven ears could hear it, and the innate babble of the hobbits hardly made sense to her as she focused her attention on Frodo. The voice grew louder in her ears, but she would be pulled back to reality with a loud comment here and there accompanied by an occasional fit of laughter. Her mind was starting to fall into confusion, and she knew she had to leave before the yearnings to hold the One Ring consumed her. Merry, Pip, I am sorry, but I have other duties I must attend to, she lied and immediately hated deceiving her friends. She needed to distance herself for the time being from anyone, especially after the emotional breakdown that she had just fallen victim to in her father's office, and she did not want to be so vulnerable in the presence of the ringbearer. Oi, but you will miss afternoon tea, Pippin protested, his eyes pleading for her to stay in their company. I will join you later, my friends, she assured them as she stood, and as Merry and Pippin nodded in acceptance, Boromir got up as well. I shall escort the lady to where she is needed, he proclaimed, and a tiny tinge of irritation assailed her at his proclamation, but she said nothing, waving to the hobbits as they took their leave. Sam and Frodo both looked up apprehensively at Boromir and Ellenmire before bidding them farewell, and Frodo's haunting eyes caught hers knowingly. She looked away guiltily, rushing out of the dining hall as quickly as she could. They did not stop walking until they were clearly a ways from the commons, and they found themselves in front of another secluded bridge, and with a start, Ellenmire recognized it as the one that she had spotted Arwen and Aragorn on many, long years ago when she had discovered the truth of their relationship. Ellenmire, Boromir asked tentatively, why did you have such a sudden urge to leave? You had just arrived, and my heart had gladdened to see that you were well. Merry and Pippin would speak of nothing else but of the Shire and of you. She smiled softly at him as they carefully walked over the bridge, staring down into their reflections in the placid stream. Lily pads graced its surface, and like a number of the other gardens of Rivendell, moss-covered rocks and white and red water lilies adorned the water's edge. The trees that surrounded them consisted of one giant sycamore along with weeping willows, whose branches reached low to gently touch the strands of their hair. The smell of the falling leaves and the rushing water was enough to remind them that autumn was fully upon them. Did you not feel it? She asked, sorrow lining her voice. Boromir understood immediately, his face growing grim, and he inhaled deeply before letting out a sigh, and turning to face her, he nodded. I feel it gnawing at my very soul, he admitted in a whisper. Its evil powers are undeniably strong, and I fear for the hobbit. Frodo is inexperienced with such evil, and I worry. Their hands found each other's and clasped, their fingers intertwining. That is why I left, she confided, now lifting her gaze to his. It was calling to me, Boromir. I heard it whispering my name, and I longed to reach to Frodo for it. Especially after an emotionally draining talk with my father, the ring must have sensed my susceptibility at that moment and called to me. Her voice lowered. I cannot trust myself in Frodo's presence. Boromir lifted her hand to his lips, and placed a gentle kiss on her palm, his eyes never leaving hers. The sensation of his surprisingly soft lips tenderly brushing her hand brought a blush to her cheeks, and she smiled foolishly, despite the difficult subject at hand. I understand, my lady, for I feel the same, he said softly, his eyes warming with affection. But, I must confess, when I am in your company, I feel as if I can avoid its evil clutches for a while. I feel that you can give me the strength, Ellenmire, to evade its call. His words touched her deeper than any she had heard before, and she could scarcely believe he was directing those sweet words to her and not running away in the opposite direction, but, for some reason it did not seem right to be with Boromir, and she angrily blamed Legolas for ever showing up in Rivendell. Had he not appeared, her feelings for Boromir would not be so tinged with guilt, and, she realized, Mary Sue would not have been included in the whole ordeal, for Legolas was the one to bring her. Her bitterness grew for the elven prince of Mirkwood, despising him for being the one she could not have and for bringing the epitome of beauty that was Mary Sue to torture her already damaged self-esteem. Her loathing was its greatest at the thought that he had polluted her ability to look favorably upon another without him entering her mind, and she wanted to rant at the unfairness of it all, especially when one as kind and as compassionate as Boromir deserved her undivided attention. Boromir's fingers were gently stroking her cheek, and she was once again quickly drawn out of her thoughts. Her heart was mercilessly beyond her control now, noting how close he had become, the lines of his face stretched with worry. His eyes pleaded with hers, but she knew not why until he spoke again. If my words displease you, I mean not to bother you further of the longings of my heart, Ellenmeyer, he sadly whispered, and she finally became aware of her facial features, silently cursing Legolas for triggering the frown that had manipulated her lips. She instantly relaxed her expression, and shook her head. Curse you, Legolas, for controlling my thoughts. She wanted to yell. No, Boromir, you misunderstand me, she quickly explained, her trembling hand reaching out to sweep the hair out of his eyes. I have no experience in this at all, she stuttered, and I do not know exactly how to handle this. It is not as if I have a line of bachelors waiting to court me, and never have I ever expected one to even glance my way. I am rather baffled that you would spend your time with me, out of all the maidens that you could choose from. Those who are far more beautiful. But you are beautiful as well, Ellenmeyer, he injected, wonder crossing his face, and her jaw dropped slightly. Do you not see it? What? She asked blankly, disbelieving the fact that he had used the word, beautiful, to describe her. Me, with my bushy hair, and this horrible nose, and this unpleasant bulge in my belly, he roared with laughter and shook his head, and even she had to crack a smile at how ridiculous she sounded. Had she always sounded that way? You must be the only one to see such things, he managed to say after his laughter died down. You are beautiful to me, my lady, both inside and out, and nothing you say can change my mind on that matter. Well, she said stiffly, you must be the only one to think such things. Those of the guard of the Rivendell see not but a bulky, bossy second captain. Suddenly a greedy possessiveness claimed the look in his eyes, and he grinned. Good, he laughed, because I do no plan on sharing you. Her eyes grew wide at the intense desire that now lit his face the same way it had when they had argued at the council, and she could not help but marvel at the thought that she was what he wanted. So is this what it is like? She idly wondered, tears suddenly forming behind her eyes from joy, but she did not cry. She became frightfully aware of the pounding of her heart drowning her ears as Boromir pulled her near, closing the distance between them, and she knew without a doubt that he was going to kiss her. I hope there are no squirrels here that plan on attacking you with acorns, she whispered dryly as her gray eyes filled with mirth, and he chuckled as he brought his face down to hers, his lips lightly brushing hers, yet not claiming them just yet. If there are, I shall not let them bother me this time around, he answered mischievously, and she closed her eyes and his lips captured hers completely, keeping their first kiss chaste, but sweet. He hesitated a moment and she opened her eyes to nod at him. He brought his lips down to hers again, this time deepening their kiss, gently sucking on her lower lip as his tongue traced the lining of it, prodding her mouth for entrance. She complied and was greeted by his tongue gently caressing hers before dueling feverishly, and the friction sent shivers up her spine and through her entire body. She became acutely aware of the tightening of his arms around her waist, and her own hands were entangled in his hair, delighting in the silky smoothness and thickness of it. Her fingers tingled as she brushed them through his strands, and she thought of the injustice of waiting for more than a millennia to experience such a feeling. Boromir reluctantly ended their fiery kiss, and she uttered a small cry of protest, earning one of his wonderful chuckles. I see the lady wants more, he teased, and she playfully swatted his arm. I would relent, but I need a chance to catch my breath. Oh, you humans are so frail. She shot out in frustration, but he took no heed of it as he enveloped her in his arms, his fingers joining hers as he hugged her around her waist, and she sighed with contentment, leaning back into him. His lips pressed against her hair, and he inhaled the faint scent of wildflowers emitting from her tresses. How she ever managed to call her sleek hair bushy was beyond him, and the supposed bulge of her belly was hardly there, now that he could try to feel for it with his arms around her. The she-elf's degradation of herself surprised him, for he saw none of the flaws she spoke of, and he made a mental note to confront Mary Sue for ever causing Ellenmeyer to think she was less than what she really was. He felt so protective of her, and he knew he did not want another person to take her away from him. Though, that posed a problem for a certain elf who was hidden once again in the thick branches and leaves of the overgrown sycamore, this time without acorns at hand for him to throw. The couple had appeared before him unexpectedly as he had been laying lazily in the tree, watching the clouds drift in beautiful harmony in the sky, and he had intently heard every single word of their conversation. Legolas wanted to throttle the man of Gondor, but he could not deny the happiness that played upon the lady's features. What if the prophecy was meant for Boromir and Ellenmeyer? He thought, and suddenly, it took on a new light. What if he was the one meant to have the broken heart? He cried out softly at the revelation. The tree whispered words of comfort to the elf, none of which calmed his nerves, and not knowing what he was about to do, he leapt out of his hiding spot, startling the two on the bridge. Call me selfish. Boromir and Ellenmeyer froze as Legolas approached them, his face neutral, but inside, a whirlwind of emotions stormed within him, and he knew not what he felt. Ah, so I see that this is a new development, he offered as they stood silent, and Boromir, who did not take note of the sarcasm in his voice, chuckled and nodded slightly. Yes, Legolas, this is, he answered, his eyes twinkling with happiness, succeeding in angering the jealous elf even more. Ellenmeyer was quiet in Boromir's arms, her eyes raging indigo at him, challenging him to make another snide comment. If you do not mind, Legolas, you are interrupting, she stated bluntly, her voice cold. I might suggest finding your love, Mary Sue, if you are in dire need of entertainment at the moment, for I do not desire another to witness this very private interlude between Boromir and myself. Legolas flinched quickly at the obvious hostility in her manner, but he quickly composed himself. To inform you, my lady, Mary Sue is not my love, as you call her, he declared indignantly, and Ellenmeyer raised an amused eyebrow at him. Is that so, my lord? She answered with mock interest. If I do recall correctly from this morning's affair, you did inform us all that she was important to you in more ways than one, obviously implying that the two of you were lovers. The kiss I happened to observe between the two of you also suggests the former. She shrugged. You puzzle me with your contradictions. Legolas gave a low growl, his eyes quickly becoming menacing, and Boromir felt Ellenmeyer tense in his arms. He gave her a reassuring squeeze to ease her back into her relaxed position, but she remained stiff. Contradictions, my lady? Legolas asked, faking sweetness. If I recall correctly, you do have an obvious dislike for humans, especially Mary Sue, but there you are in the arms of one. You are a contradiction yourself, Ellenmeyer. Boromir cleared his throat, hating the denigrating connotation in reference to humans, and he knew that Ellenmeyer did not truly hate those of the line of men. She only hated one in particular for her annoying perfection, but she covered up her loathing with the visage of detesting all humans. That is not fair, Legolas, he stated calmly, for you do not understand the lady's mind and what she means by her words. And you do, Boromir. Legolas shot out coolly. You yourself have only known Ellenmeyer for several days. Ellenmeyer broke free from Boromir's hold, and she approached the elven prince, folding her arms tightly across her chest. What is it that you want, Legolas? She finally snapped, her voice raising a decibel. A fear rose in her throat when a gleam of jest flashed across his cerulean eyes, and he gave a shadow of a smile. You have already asked me that question today, my lady, before I had the chance to tell you, he said, his voice softening a bit. Are you sure you want me to answer you in front of the man of Gondor? Ellenmeyer felt Boromir approach from behind her, and he looked curiously from Legolas to Ellenmeyer before settling his gaze on Legolas. Why would you not want to say it in front of me? He asked slowly, and Legolas silently cheered. Nothing was going to prevent him this time, he thought determinedly. Holy Valar, let this be my chance to say it. He prayed inwardly. Let her decide now who she wants. Legolas took a breath and began, ignoring the worry that covered Ellenmeyer's face. You can call me selfish, Ellenmeyer, but all I want is, the Valar had obviously heard enough of Legolas's meddling, for a musical cry lifted into the air, sounding much like that of the nightingale, and into the garden gracefully bounced the object of Ellenmeyer's disgust, Mary Sue. Oh, Legolas, there you are. She cried out happily, completely ignoring the other two who stood beside him. I've been looking for you ever since I left Elrond's office and… Mary Sue, please, not now, Legolas practically begged, swearing underneath his breath at another fouled attempt to speak his heart. We shall converse later. But I've been waiting the whole day to really get to speak with you alone, and now that I've found you, her voice faded away as a tear trekked slowly down her bruised cheek, and although her face was now lopsided from her injuries, the sunlight sparkled off her lengthy jet black hair, tinting it a dark violet to match her wondrous eyes, complimenting her. Unlike in the dark corridor that she and Ellenmeyer had exchanged their hostile words, the sunlight seemed to conceal the ugliness of her temporarily tarnished face, and once again, a beauty radiated from her. The tears that had found their way down the curves of her face glistened like tiny cuts of diamonds, and the two males found themselves breathless at the sight of her, much to Ellenmeyer's utter dismay. A quick tug on Boromir's hand brought him back into focus, and he looked down apologetically at Ellenmeyer when she scowled at him. Please, there's no need to cry, Mary Sue, Legolas said, surprised that his voice was tender when addressing her. Damn, he thought, why must she be so pleasing to the eye? Yes, Mary Sue, Ellenmeyer found herself saying in agreement. Her voice sounded rather congenial and foreign to her ears, but she saw this as the only chance for her to escape before Legolas could say something to ruin her newly established relationship with Boromir. Boromir and I were just leaving, so Legolas is free for the time being. Mary Sue gaped at the she-elf in disbelief, never deeming it possible to have her civil words directed at her. Legolas looked helplessly between the two females, now completely at loss as to what to say or what to do to get himself out of another tiring moment with Mary Sue. Is this a joke? She choked out, wiping her tears away, glancing down at the clasped hands of Boromir and Ellenmeyer, and she shook her head in confusion. Wait, do you mean to tell me that you and Boromir? It is encouraging to see that your skills in deduction are far better than your skills in fighting, young one, Ellenmeyer answered wryly, smirking. But Mary Sue cared not for her sarcasm nor for the fact that Ellenmeyer had unwittingly given Mary Sue somewhat of a compliment. Her mind focused only on one person alone, Legolas. A smile consumed her lips, and she grinned widely, feeling much more confident that because Ellenmeyer now was with Boromir, Legolas was all hers for the taking. However, he groaned inwardly, cursing both Ellenmeyer and Mary Sue for toying with him when he had far more important subjects to think about, but he watched dejectedly as Ellenmeyer and Boromir bid them farewell. They walked back into the house of Elrond, hand in hand, laughing merrily at some sort of private joke. Aren't you happy for them? Mary Sue squealed giddily. I honestly don't know how he can stand her, but I guess he puts her in some sort of good mood or whatever. That was like the first time she ever talked to me without totally insulting me. She craned her neck to look at Legolas. What's wrong? You look so stern. He shook his head and attempted to walk away from her, but she would not let him leave so easily. Legolas, stop. He paused at her words, but did not bother to face her. I am in a rather irritable mood, he explained hastily. Well, so am I. She cried out, placing both her hands on her hips, her right arm now free of the sling. She had decided to free herself of it, especially after the meeting with Elrond. There was no way she would try to do anything to annoy him ever again, if she could help it. You have no right to treat me this way, as if I am some sort of bother to you. There was a slight tremble in her voice, and he turned around, surprised to see her confidence leaking out of her. She looked rather insecure now, her eyes not meeting his. If you really don't want to spend time talking to me, then why don't you just tell me instead of pretending otherwise? Her shoulders shook visibly this time, as if she were trying to hold in her tears. Mary Sue, he could find no other words to say, feeling slightly helpless now that he knew she was not as oblivious as he thought she was. He did not want to hurt her, nor did he want to hurt anybody, but seeing this exposed side of her, a side she never really expressed to anyone, made him feel even more guilty for trying to deceive her. He sighed in resignation. Now that she had fully caught on to him, he had better tell her the truth. You do have a right to know, and it was insensitive of me to carry on as if you would not notice. So you'll tell me then. The tears fell, but she did not bother to wipe them from her face. Instead, she kept her gaze steady, waiting for his inevitable rejection. He was secretly surprised at the strength she showed, and a seed of doubt wheedled its way into his mind. Was he making a mistake in trying to pursue Ellenmeyer, who obviously had no interest in him, now that she had Boromir? Was there some other side to Mary Sue that, perhaps, he had overlooked in his hastiness to captivate the untouchable she-elf? The longer he studied the girl in front of him, the more his doubts increased, and he hesitated a moment before speaking his mind to her. Oh, he was terribly confused. Even after almost 3,000 years, females, no matter what race, were still a mystery to him. Yes, he answered slowly. She closed her eyes a moment before opening them, bracing herself for the words she was sure were going to hurt her. Mary Sue, I know your opinions of me are rather kind, but I feel as if, he struggled with his words. You do not know who I am, young one, and yet you, fling yourself at me at rather awkward situations. I am quite flattered by your attentions, but you do not know me, and I do not know you. Yes, our conversations are pleasant enough, but they are far from profound. You have not shared one personal aspect of your life with me, Mary Sue, and I have yet to do the same. We are only friends, and that is as much as I am comfortable with. Don't try to appease me with your fancy words, Legolas, she cut in evenly, her tone steady. The tears had stopped flowing, yet streaks remained on her cheeks. It is because of Ellenmeyer, isn't it? His eyes widened, and he could not form words, confirming her suspicions. She nodded and closed her eyes briefly, a spasm of pain distorting her facial expression, but it was quickly gone. I don't understand why everyone is so into her. Legolas raised his eyebrows. Excuse me, it wasn't really possible that Mary Sue could be jealous over Ellenmeyer, was it? At the banquet a few nights before, he had only thought Mary Sue to speak such words out of anger, but today, there was something different in her voice. He also remembered Ellenmeyer's earlier words when she had voiced her worries to Boromir, and it puzzled him to hear an almost identical tone coming from Mary Sue. She glared at him, bitterness filling her eyes. I said, I don't understand why you and everyone else in this fucking town is so obsessed with her. She spat, her voice raising slightly. I mean, everyone is always on her side. You, Boromir, Lord Elrond, the hobbits. Are you jealous? He asked in disbelief. Mary Sue stiffened and looked down at her feet, as if they had suddenly become her newest obsession. How can I be jealous of someone as ugly like her? She asked, Her voice low, but there was a lack of certainty in her tone, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. She's so masculine in her tunic and leggings, and she's barbaric when she fights, so why should I be jealous of someone like that? She looked up defiantly, flipping her lustrous locks over her shoulder. I mean, I'm at least good looking, and the words caught in her throat as she choked back a sob. No one cares about me, Legolas. The confession caught him off guard, and all he could do was gape at the girl. What? He asked rather stupidly, unsure of what else to say. She looked up, both her pride and dignity injured, and it showed on her face and in the way she stood. Gone was the confident look of superiority. Gone was the proud stance. Left standing in front of him was someone he was seeing for the first time, a lonely, apprehensive young woman. No one cares about me, Legolas, she repeated, her eyes downcast. What I mean to say was, I was scared when I first appeared near Mirkwood. I didn't know where I was, why I was brought here, or who the heck you were, and you didn't help when you kept that arrow pointed at me. Why do you think I put up a mask? I had to protect myself one way or another. You wore no such mask when I found you, he commented, his brow furrowing in confusion. She sighed. It was a figure of speech, Legolas, she stated simply. I had to appear confident. I didn't want anyone to think that I was some sort of a coward. But you shrank away in fear when Ellenmeyer confronted you in the woods, he pointed out insensitively, and she flinched at his choice of words. Well, what do you think females do all the time? She asked. We compare ourselves to each other, if you hadn't caught on by now. Of course, at first glance Ellenmeyer wasn't totally pretty, but it was your attention to her that made me sneer at her the way I did that first time. And she totally took it the wrong way. She sank down at the trunk of the sycamore, burying her face in her hands. I can't believe I'm telling you all this. Legolas sat down next to her and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Well, I must admit, it is much more appealing to have you confide in me as you would a friend instead of trying to attack me as if I were a piece of red meat you have been craving for, he answered dryly, and she blushed slightly. I'm sorry, she apologized quietly. It doesn't help that you are a beautiful creature, Legolas. You can't totally blame me for being selfish when it comes to you. He fell silent, surprised at her bluntness and at her choice of words, knowing that that was exactly what he had wanted to say to Ellenmeyer. Is that why you've been avoiding me? She questioned, lifting her violet eyes to look into his, and she tilted her head in curiosity. Because I was too eager. To be honest with you, yes, he confirmed, nodding. It would help just a bit if you were not so aggressive. He shuddered as he remembered the numerous banquets and balls his father, King Thranduil, had arranged in their home in northern Mirkwood. Not once could Legolas get through the night without one or two females following his every move, and he could not stand their overly inviting glances. Mary Sue studied his face and gave a hint of a smile. I take it, by the look on your face, that I'm not the only one in this place who's tried to pursue you before, she smirked, and he gave a slight nod. Affirmative, he answered. Although it is highly amusing, I cannot help but feel trapped when such things occur. So I must also ask for your pardon on my actions of the past few days, for not voicing my objections before. It was not fair to myself, nor was it fair to you. She also nodded, and for the first time, she bestowed on him a radiant smile, one full of sincerity. Can we start over again, Legolas? She asked shyly. I would very much like to establish a friendship with you, and I promise not to jump you, not yet anyway. He chuckled. Of course, he approved, giving her a smile of his own. I am quite happy that we had this discussion. Besides, if we are to travel together on this journey, it would be much easier to get along with you than to avoid you. I couldn't agree more. She laughed. She stuck out her hand to him. Truce. He grinned as he took hold of it and shook it. Truce. Dilemma. Ellenmeyer sat with her back against the bark of a sturdy elm in the clearing where she and Mary Sue had been training together every morning for the past 2 months. Boromir and Legolas, of course, watched and assisted in every lesson, but Mary Sue, being the near-perfect girl that she was, had become an expert in sword fighting and nearly surpassed Ellenmeyer in her skill, almost, but not quite. Ellenmeyer, after all, did have thousands of years of experience, but Mary Sue was still one who could challenge any of the guard of Rivendell, save Elrohir and Elladan, since she had not the chance to duel with them for they were still preoccupied with their own mission these past 2 months. That morning's training was no different, and Ellenmeyer sighed in resignation. Mary Sue was sure to surpass her skill soon, and she knew it was inevitable. They had been civil with each other throughout the training within the 2 months, but Ellenmeyer found all ways possible to avoid the girl when not instructing her, especially now that Legolas and Mary Sue had become inseparable since the day Boromir and Ellenmeyer had left them in the garden under the sycamore. Yes, she was happy with Boromir, and he with her, but Ellenmeyer knew that a part of her would always long for Legolas, and she shook her head in disgust with herself. She had finally found someone who actually loved her for who she was, with flaws and all. He had whispered the words to her but 3 nights ago, and she readily reciprocated them as well, and she had spent nearly all her life looking for that. But she found it repulsive that no matter how much she had grown to love Boromir, Legolas still had custody of her heart in some way. She looked to her left where Boromir was sitting quietly beside her, with her hand in his as he closed his eyes in contentment, letting out a sigh of relief that the training was over for the day, and her heart did flutter at the sight of him, but there was something missing, and she knew it. She turned her attention back to the couple that had proceeded to leave the clearing as soon as Elendmire had dismissed them for the day. Mary Sue clung to Legolas's arm as they headed toward their separate rooms to prepare for tonight's dinner, and their laughter reached her elven ears, reverberating and slicing into her consciousness. Elendmire envied them for appearing so cheerful together, but at the same time, it gave her joy to see Legolas's face light up with happiness. She hated herself for being so torn, so confused, when she knew she had every right to be just as happy as they, with Boromir by her side. She frowned. She had thought that by being with Boromir, Legolas would fade from her thoughts, but the opposite was true. Each and every day, Legolas consumed her mind and forever lingered there, stubbornly torturing her with his image, his soft words, his loving glances, slowly driving her mad. She felt herself being pulled gently into a warm embrace, and she looked up into Boromir's tender eyes, before he leaned down and lovingly brushed his lips against hers. She shivered, and he tightened his arms around her, softly rocking her. She found her fingers caressing the smooth exterior of his cheek as he deepened their kiss, his lips and tongue tasting her, drinking her in. His warm breath comforted her from her disturbing thoughts, and she felt herself drowning in his scent of elm and birch. Yes, she loved Boromir, there was no doubt, and although Legolas still remained in her heart somewhere, insisting and pursuing her relentlessly, Boromir always knew the right way to remind her of his love for her and knew how to ignite the flame of her love for him as well. "My dearest heart," he whispered when his lips finally left hers, and she smiled at the endearment. They merely sat there for several peaceful moments, staring into each other's eyes before his clouded over somewhat, and she felt the tremble in his arms. "What is it, love?" she asked, concern worrying her brow. She played with several strands of his silky hair through her fingertips, waiting for his answer. Studying his fair face, she felt all her defenses weaken somewhat. Boromir was a beautiful being inside and out, and she could not believe that out of all maidens, he had chosen her. She did not feel worthy of his love, but felt lucky all the same that she was its recipient. "I cannot help but think of the future, no matter how bleak it seems," he murmured softly. "When I gaze into your eyes, there is no other desire in my heart stronger than the one of bringing you with me to Minas Tirith, but it seems so far and out of reach." His melancholia of late had been disquieting, and Elendmire started at his words. "He wants me to go home with him," she thought, panic settling in for a moment. Why had he not said anything before? She managed to keep her breath steady as she contemplated over the meaning behind his words. Did he want her as his wife? After 2 months of courting, she should have given at least a thought to the possibility, but she was still reeling from the fact that someone actually loved her and marriage was far beyond her comprehension at the moment. Could she spend her life with Boromir by her side as her husband? And if she could, she was still half elven, but because she was not truly of Lord Elrond's line, would she be able to have the chance to choose between her immortal life and the life of men? A sudden realization came over her as these thoughts raced through her head in the mere seconds of silence she had before she could give him a comforting reply. Yes, she would marry him if given the chance. Even if her heart did belong to Legolas, he surely did not want her when he had Mary Sue, and Boromir was a noble man who would be a wonderful husband to her. Shaking out of her thoughts, she clung to Boromir, forcing all images of Legolas out of her head. "Ah, love, everything will turn out as it should in the end," she whispered soothingly, trying desperately to ease his anxiety of the journey ahead. "Remember the prophecy, Boromir. We will overcome this evil, and we will be free too." "I cannot settle the disquiet in my heart, Elendmire," he cut in. His eyes misted with sadness. "I feel a sense of dread creep into my bones when I think of what we must do, and I am scared." She whispered comforting words in Elvish, despite the fact that he knew not what she said, and she leaned her head in the nook where his neck met his shoulder, grazing her lips across the soft flesh there before tracing a feather-light trail of kisses along his jaw until their lips met once more. "Please, worry not, love," she pleaded quietly. "We shall fight our way through this darkness." He said nothing, but drew her closer to him, and together they studied the beauty of Rivendell, peacefully listening to the steady beating of their hearts. "This is unexpected," a voice called out just behind them, and they both jumped at the sound. Elendmire felt a flush smear her cheeks, knowing that there was only one person who could truly catch her at unawares, and she ran toward the source of the voice, her arms spread open. "Elladan," she cried out as he stepped out from behind a birch, grinning foolishly, and he caught her in his arms and twirled her around. "Mire," he laughed, "it is wonderful to see you again. Boromir approached them, a smile on his lips as he held out his hand in greeting. Boromir of Gondor. Elladan boomed in greeting. Hello, Elladan, he answered jovially, and a shy Ellenmeyer moved to his side, taking his hand in hers. Yes, I guess you could say this was unexpected, but I can honestly say I never found happiness until now. Boromir's eyes twinkled as he looked down at his love, who now appeared flustered at his words. Oh, stop, Ellenmeyer muttered dryly, rolling her eyes playfully as she shook her head in embarrassment. Elladan laughed heartily. I am pleased someone has finally captured my dear sister's heart, he stated simply as he took her other hand and linked it through his arm, and Ellenmeyer felt herself blush to an even darker shade of crimson, not from embarrassment this time, but from shame. If he only knew who, her heart pointed out. Let us all leave for dinner, shall we? Elladan's voice brought her attention back to the present conversation. You will tell me what you've discovered, will you not, Elladan? She pleaded as they all walked together out of the clearing. I have sorely missed both you and Elro here. Oh, he teased with an amused grin, though his eyes betrayed his worries of his travels. Surely, you could not have missed us that much, especially with Boromir to keep you company. She knew he was diverting the conversation away from her previous question, and she gracefully followed his lead, jotting down a mental note to ask him later, as she feigned a look of intense consideration. Actually, you're right, she said, shrugging indifferently, and Boromir guffawed. Come to think of it, I really did not miss you all that much. A grin played upon her lips as her brother joined in Boromir's laughter. Ah, Boromir, he said, addressing the man, you have found yourself a feisty one. Are you sure you still want her? Boromir's eyes twinkled down at her again and nodded his head. I have never been more sure of anything else, he said wistfully, and she gently squeezed his hand in affection, but her heart remained heavy with the weight of her weakness for Legolas. You love Boromir, she scolded herself silently as the two males continued the conversation as they walked through the corridors. But you love Legolas, as well, don't you? Another part screamed at her, and from the painful throbbing in her chest, she assumed it to be her heart. I do not know him well enough to love him. Her mind yelled just as fervently. But you love him all the same. Love at first sight does not exist. If you insist, well, it doesn't. You don't sound too sure of yourself. I love Boromir. Like I said, if you insist. The mental argument between her mind and her heart finally stopped as they reached her room, and she shook her head in amazement at herself. The relationship between her mind and her heart had never been estranged until now, and she was at a loss at which to follow. She lifted her eyes to look at the two who had escorted her to her room, and by their stares, it seemed as though they had been awaiting some sort of answer from her, and she bit her lip apologetically. I am sorry, she stammered, looking at one and then the other. You must excuse me, it seems my mind had drifted for a moment. Only a moment, her heart drawled sarcastically, and her mind countered with a threatening pound of the beginnings of a headache. What was it you asked? Are you feeling ill, my lady? Boromir asked again gently, concern wrinkling his brow, and she felt a pang of regret tinged with guilt that she could not completely give her heart to this amazing person. She smiled weakly, and shook her head. No, I will be fine, she assured the two of them. I just need to wash up for dinner, and I will be ready momentarily. Elladan nodded and moved to leave, but paused in amusement to watch Boromir bring Ellenmeyer's hand to his lips, leaving a gentle kiss on her palm, and not once did they break their gaze. I shall be ready to escort you when you are, dearest heart, he whispered in a low tone, forgetting that Elladan could still hear him with his acute hearing. Elladan shot her a foolish smile, and as she flicked her hand in irritation to dismiss him, he let out a hearty laugh before leaving to his quarters. With Elladan gone, Ellenmeyer pulled Boromir close and brushed her lips softly against his before ducking away into her room where a giggling handmaid greeted her. And I thought I would never see the day when the Lady Ellenmeyer would ever allow anyone to do such a thing as kiss her hand, Anaril teased as she led Ellenmeyer to her bath. Annoyed, Ellenmeyer flicked water in her direction, causing her friend to squeal. Will you ever stop this incessant babble? She groaned, allowing herself to relax in the warmth of the water. She was in no mood for more teasing, she would receive enough of it from her brothers as soon as she entered for dinner, she was sure. Even more maddening was the constant advice Arwen loved to give her at any opportune moment. If there were a time where she could find peace away from it all, she gladly took it, and she was not about to let Anaril spoil it for her. You know I am just delighted at the turn of events, Arwen Amin, Anaril sighed, taking note of Ellenmeyer's foul mood. It is assuring to see someone finally break through that barrier of yours to steal your heart. The thief, Ellenmeyer muttered wryly. I will be sure to set out the appropriate punishments for him later on. Anaril sighed and rolled her eyes at the lady's sarcasm. He is saving your life, you know, she whispered quietly, and Ellenmeyer looked up sharply at her. What do you mean, if I may be so bold to say such a thing, but before you met Boromir, I feared for you, my lady, she muttered, folding clothes to detach herself somewhat from the conversation. She knew she was treading on unsteady ground by speaking her mind. Ellenmeyer could be proud to the point of being stubborn. Whatsoever for? Ellenmeyer demanded indignantly, straightening up in her bath. I am well, as you can plainly see. I can take care of myself. I never intended to imply that you could not, Anarel quickly explained, her eyes growing wide before returning to their natural size. She looked away. I meant no offense, my lady. I only say the things I do because I am concerned. There was a moment of silence before Ellenmeyer sighed. I know, Anarel, Ellenmeyer whispered, closing her eyes as she sank even deeper into the water. Please, continue. I did not mean to lash out at you like I did. I apologize. There is no need for you to do so, Arwen Amin. She bestowed on her a motherly smile. I understand the past 2 months have not been easy. Which is why I am grateful that Boromir is in your life. She inhaled deeply before letting out a slow breath. I was worried about you because it was only obvious you were fading, and you had even expressed your trepidations as well. She set out Ellenmeyer's clothes as she spoke. I am so happy that you have finally found love, found something to live for, Ellenmeyer. We were close to losing you. She turned her back to the lady, not wanting her to see the sadness upon her face. Ah, Anarel, Ellenmeyer thought silently, if only you knew how close I am at the moment to losing myself to my indecisiveness. It was true that the light of her soul was now easily seen around her, but compared to the others, her light was still so very dim. She was happier, yes, but not fully, at least not yet, and her glow reflected that. Boromir had noticed, of course, but he accepted her reasoning when she blamed it on her fear of the journey. Thank you, she replied instead to the handmaiden, for being one of the few to really care about me, Anarel. Anarel frowned. You do not give yourself enough credit, my lady, she chastised, motioning for her to hurry with her bath. No more was said between them as Ellenmeyer quickly finished and dressed in her usual attire with her sword at her waist, her bow and quiver on her back. She gave Anarel a soft smile of thanks before she headed out of her door where Boromir waited for her, and hand in hand they walked together to the commons. The activity in the room was more lively than usual, now that all of the scouts had finally returned from their excursion. Again, as always, Ellenmeyer's eyes landed on Legolas and Mary Sue at their usual seats at the head table as she and Boromir waded through the crowd to reach theirs. And, as was his habit, Legolas always managed to fix his gaze on her the same moment her eyes sought out his, and he nodded in her direction, sending her a welcoming smile. Then on cue, Mary Sue caught his fixed gaze and sent Ellenmeyer her own forced smile, though her eyes shot daggers at her. Ellenmeyer sighed. Some things never change. The scene replayed night after night, in different variations of course, but always stuck to the same formula. They finally reached the table, and she took her seat by her father, who was involved in an intense, private conversation with Aragorn. The ranger sat on Elrond's other side by Arwen, who greeted Ellenmeyer with her own beautiful smile, and her eyes twinkled always at the sight of Ellenmeyer and Boromir together. Oh, no, she thought in discouragement as Arwen whispered an excuse to Aragorn and Elrond and rose from her seat to approach her sister. Ah, Ellenmeyer, Boromir. She called out the same greeting every night in her amazingly song-like voice. Good evening, dear sister, Ellenmeyer answered, feeling a smile tug on her lips despite her annoyance. Arwen gracefully reached their side, planting herself right in the between the two of them as they took their seats. And how is the lovely couple tonight? Arwen asked, raising an eyebrow. We are well, Lady Arwen, Boromir answered politely, giving her the same response he always did for the past 2 months as he nodded his head in her direction. And how fare you, my lady? Wonderful, she answered automatically, a smile lighting up her already beautifully glowing face. She said no more as she gestured for Boromir to eat the dinner that had been placed before him, and Ellenmeyer reached for the sliced fruits on her plate when Arwen gently touched her arm. We must talk, Ellenmeyer, Arwen said so quietly that only she could hear her. There are a few things I would very much like to give you counsel for. Of course, Ellenmeyer inwardly groaned but smiled all the same at her sister, who looked incredibly pleased. I will collect you after you have finished your meal, she whispered before rising from her seat, and raising her voice to its normal pitch, she addressed the two of them. I cannot express how happy I am for the both of you. We shall all have a chat later. With that, she smoothly crossed back to her seat and sat down. As she always says each and every night, Ellenmeyer whispered, moving into the seat next to Boromir. I think we get the point. She tilted her head in amusement as Boromir shot her a look as he almost choked on a piece of meat from nearly laughing out loud. Sorry, love, she apologized, grinning. They spent the remainder of their dinner in comfortable silence as they observed the crowd in the dining hall, and only uttered their welcome to her brothers as they joined them. As she suspected, Elrohir and Elladan began their teasing almost immediately, and she had to keep her wits about her to keep them from using their most insensitive jokes. However, She soon found that she cared not what they said about her relationship with Boromir, though both she and Boromir were red from embarrassment at their suggestive comments, for their opinion did not matter much, and she kept a small smile on her face. Boromir had changed her a bit during their couple of months together, she realized suddenly. Now that she was sure she had someone to love her for what she was, she cared less of how others perceived her, especially Mary Sue. Her smile grew wider as she studied him interact with her twin brothers. Not only did he give her his love, he gave her a bit more confidence as well, and she knew that to share her lifetime with him would only be the least she could do. Her brothers discovered soon enough that she was not the same. Their comments were heard, but went by unheeded, and it was unusual for Ellenmeyer to do such a thing. They kept their amazement in check as she gently shook her head at them as if to scold them for their antics, but the genuine smile of happiness on her face was unmistakable, and it even surprised them when she joined in their friendly banter to insult them. They could not faze her like before, and they looked on in appreciation at the man of Gondor for the positive influence he had on their sister. Ellenmeyer, a soft voice interrupted, and the four of them looked up to Arwen, and nodding, Ellenmeyer rose to join her. She put her hand up in protest when Boromir rose as well, and he sat back down in understanding. I shall not be long, she said to him, her eyes reflecting the love she saw in his, and he caught hold of the hand she had held up, brushing his lips against it, causing a huge smile to spread across both their faces. Arwen suppressed a giggle as she gently tugged on Ellenmeyer's other arm, pulling her away. Linking their arms together, they left Boromir to the relentless teasing of the twins. The two sisters walked in silence, Ellenmeyer letting Arwen lead the way, and they arrived in the tiny glen of weeping willows where Ellenmeyer and Boromir had shared their first kiss. They settled on the grass underneath the tall sycamore, watching the final caresses of the sun's last rays on the night sky, and Ellenmeyer dared to break the peace and spoke first. What was it that you wanted to talk to me about, Arwen? She asked, tilting her head in curiosity. It is about Aragorn, Arwen stated simply, never taking her eyes from the rising moon. He is troubled by this quest. His time has come to reclaim the throne of Gondor and lead his people against this darkness. I know I cannot take part of this journey with him, but you will. Her love for Aragorn shone brightly on her face, and once again, Ellenmeyer felt intimidated by her beauty, grateful that the coming night hid her bland face from Arwen. Instinctively, she sucked in her belly as to hide her bulge, unable to totally free herself of her self-consciousness. What is it that you ask of me? Ellenmeyer inquired, and Arwen finally turned to look at her. Be there for him, she answered bluntly. He does not disclose his fears easily, but you are his closest friend on this journey, Ellenmeyer, next to Mithrandir. I know he can take care of himself physically, but I am worried about his mentality, especially with all the pressures he must face concerning his rightful title. Ellenmeyer nodded. Please, make sure he is all right. Of course, Arwen, she agreed. I will do it not only because you ask it of me, but because, as his friend, it is my obligation. Arwen smiled, supplying the glen with her inner glow. Thank you, she said gratefully, giving her a hug. Pulling back, a mischievous look crossed her face, and she lifted her eyebrow in question. So how are things with Boromir? Ellenmeyer let out an exasperated groan, and shook her head. I knew I would not be able to escape your curiosity so quickly, she sighed, grinning. What are sisters for? She laughed back. Come, you have not told me much, and he has been courting you for 2 months. 2 months, Ellenmeyer. How dare you not share your intrigues with me? Oh, with Anarel's pestering questions, I only hope to avoid any more, she said, joining her laughter, and their voices lifted into the night air, mixing amid the various songs of the nightingales. Come now, when did he first kiss you? Arwen asked, her eyes shining, and Ellenmeyer blushed. They had never really confided in each other concerning such things before, not that Ellenmeyer had much experience before Boromir, nor did she want to hear such details from Arwen about Aragorn. Jealousy prevented her from asking such inquiries in the past, but Ellenmeyer had to admit, there was a sense of excitement now, recalling her feelings during that special moment with Boromir, and it made her beyond giddy to finally be able to share something like this with Arwen. It was the day of my first failed attempt to train Mary Sue, she answered, wrinkling her nose as if a putrid smell had suddenly engulfed her. She gestured to the bridge over the small stream just to the left of where they sat. It was there, in the middle of that bridge. Arwen giggled as she shot a glance to the spot before turning her attention back to Ellenmeyer. Well, how was it? She demanded eagerly, and Ellenmeyer's eyes widened, and she looked away as she recalled the feelings, the sensations, and she felt her neck heat up with warmth. At first, it was strange, she commented shyly. I did not know exactly how to respond, but when our mouths opened and, I cannot believe I am telling you this. She buried her face in her hands, and Arwen let out a loud peal clutching her stomach as she struggled to breathe. Let me guess, she stammered between her howls of laughter. Your mind went completely blank and you lost all feeling in your knees and you felt like you were about to topple over had he not had his arms around you. There were stars bursting underneath your closed lids and you saw dazzling firework displays much like Mithrandir's conjured tricks. Is that how it is supposed to feel like? Ellenmeyer asked blankly, unable to close her mouth before the words slipped through. Oh, I did not mean it like that. But Arwen's eyes grew as wide as saucers and her jaw dropped slightly. You mean, that was not how it felt? She asked, her voice barely audible. Well, I did feel rather weak, Ellenmeyer stammered, her face heating up. It felt wonderful, and I did rather protest when he stopped. The corners of Arwen's lips twitched up at this, but firework displays and the stars and such, there were none. She bit her lip as she struggled to analyze the clear look of puzzlement on the Evenstar's face. Is that odd? Do you see glittering lights underneath your lids when you and Aragorn? Her voice trailed off, shifting uncomfortably, and she could not believe she had asked a question she would not have dared to ask many years before. Yes, beyond any doubt, I do, Arwen said automatically, a faint pink touching the apples of her cheeks, and each kiss we share feels exactly like the first, it is difficult to explain. She shook her head slightly. I do not know what this means between you and Boromir, but he makes you happy, does he not? Yes, Ellenmeyer confirmed with a sure nod, and Arwen settled back to lean against the bark of the sycamore. Then that is all that matters, she assured her sister, smiling. What happened next? Ellenmeyer shrugged. Nothing really, she stated, furrowing her brow as she recalled the events. He just held me in his arms, and then Legolas, she cut off her voice to inhale sharply before beginning again. He had been watching us again the entire time from this very sycamore, and he finally made his presence known after it had happened. Arwen's posture snapped straight in surprise. Again, she repeated. He watched you before. She shook her head in amazement at how interesting the entire story was turning out. Yes, he was in the foliage the other time when Boromir was about to kiss me in one of the other gardens, but before he could, Legolas threw an acorn directly at him, succeeding in hitting Boromir in between his brows. Ellenmeyer bit her lip, recalling the mischievous smile that Legolas had given her after she had caught him, and she could not stop her heart from leaping excitedly at the memory. I honestly did not know what had gotten into him to incite him to do such a thing. Arwen was quiet a moment before she spoke, her words clearer than the ringing of silver trumpets. Legolas is in love with you, Arwen stated matter-of-factly, crossing her arms at her conclusion. What? Ellenmeyer spluttered hotly, shaking her head in denial. The thought had crossed her mind a few times before, but hearing it spoke aloud was unnerving. Of course not, Arwen. That is ludicrous. He has that beautiful, perfect girl, Mary Sue, and he's using her to make you jealous. Yes, Ellenmeyer exclaimed, and then let out a low growl. No, Arwen, let me finish. You are distracting me. But Arwen shook her head. Ellenmeyer, in all the talks I have tried to have with you about Boromir, not once did I see this sort of passion from you, and the mere mention of Legolas' name makes you jump, she said calmly, her voice pacifying. Ellenmeyer folded her hands nervously over her lap, refusing to look up. I know you love Boromir, dear sister, it is written plainly across your face. But maybe, he is your love, but not your true love, Ellenmeyer. Before Ellenmeyer could counter with a reasonable retort, the sound of footsteps hushed their voices and they turned to see Aragorn walking in their direction. He smiled apologetically at having disturbed them, but Ellenmeyer was on her feet and gestured for him to sit by Arwen. No, please stay, Aragorn, she insisted, shooting a furtive glance at her sister who was all smiles at the sight of her lover. I was just about to leave anyway. She grasped her sister's hand and gave it a squeeze before walking back toward the terrace that led to her room. Legolas in love with me. Her mind scoffed. That is just ridiculous. Of all the things she had to say, she paused a moment down the corridor that led to her chambers when she felt her heart call out for her to turn and flee down the other direction. She paused, resting her hand on a railing, and her heart once again fluttered vigorously, pleading with her. Oh, why not, she muttered to herself, and allowed her feet to carry her down another alleyway, not knowing what exactly she was looking for nor where precisely her heart was trying to lead her to. Her heart finally resumed a normal heart rate when she found herself in a circular gazebo set underneath Hegan cherry trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches and the arched top of the gazebo, and she idly wondered why she felt so drawn to the place. When she was younger, she loved to read there when the trees were in bloom, and their pink and red flower petals would fall softly onto the pages of whatever books she carried with her, delighting her to no end. She smiled at the memory, when unexpectedly, her heart pounded harshly against her ribs. She turned around, feeling a presence of a person behind her, and inhaled sharply. The moonlight only enhanced his ethereal glow, casting his blonde locks silver, and in the stillness of the night, his blue eyes shone softly in her direction, a soft smile playing on his lips. His arms hung calmly to his sides, and his head was tilted slightly as he studied her. He whispered but one word in a question, as if unsure of the vision in front of him. Ellenmeyer. Her spine tingled as her name rolled off his tongue, she felt paralyzed. Only 3 feet separated them, and she wondered how he had snuck up behind her. Only Eladin could do that. Legolas, she replied back in greeting, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. I see you haven't learned your lesson, have you? She joked lightly, though her voice sounded strained. Boromir is not here for you to throw acorns at, I'm afraid, but you follow me nonetheless. I dare not do such a thing now, he said, never moving a muscle, not when you are so heavily guarded by your lover. She tried to keep her face impassive, hoping that he could not see how weak he made her feel by merely looking at her. Then why are you here, if you had not been following me? She asked him carefully, desperately digressing away from the mention of Boromir. I think, my lady, that you had followed me here, he said in an equal tone. I came here to think on my own, but I was here but for less than 5 minutes when you arrived. I did not see you, she said defensively, her eyes flaring a bit, so you cannot accuse me of following you. A frown tugged on his lips, but he dared not lose their eye contact. Nay, my lady, he said softly, I do not accuse you, I merely stated what I had hoped was true. Her words caught in her throat, and she swallowed back the retorts she had lined up to shoot at him. I should go then, she said hastily, and looked away as she crossed in front of him to leave, but he caught hold of her hand and spun her around to face him. Stop running from me, Ellenmeyer, he whispered in her ear as he pulled her close. Please, stop. She froze in his arms, unable to stop the heat that burned through her skin at the mere contact of his embrace. She attempted to push him away, but as her hands felt the strong muscular chest through his tunic, oh holy Valar, she was weakening. She felt it in her entire body, and her breath grew shallow at standing so close to him. You have to let me go, Legolas, she pleaded, tears forming in her eyes. This was not what she needed to add to her already confused mind, and the only thought she had that moment was to flee into the safety of her chambers. The longer she stayed in his arms, the greater her desire became to fling everything out of her mind and to succumb to the insistent need to feel his lips pressed against hers, to tell him how much her heart longed for him. No, you know I cannot do that, he choked out, not until you tell me there is nothing between us, not until I do this. Her eyes grew wide as his fingers traced her lips before they were replaced with his own, gently tugging at hers, as if afraid she would disappear from his arms in any moment. She fell into the kiss, closing her eyes as she responded, and suddenly, beneath her lids, stars as bright as Arendelle streaked across her conscious mind, as spectacular as any of Gandalf's fireworks. Her knees were close to giving away, but he held her steady with his strong arms. Her heart was soaring, and she felt free, for the first time. Barely aware of her surroundings, her mouth allowed him access willingly, and his tongue teased her lips in her palate before gently caressing her own tongue, and she gasped at the incredible, almost unbearable heat that rose from her body in response to just one kiss from Legolas, but no, this was not right. She was not supposed to be standing underneath the moonlight with him, no matter how much this kiss made her feel so, completely whole and untarnished. Boromir. Her mind yelled insanely at her. Think about Boromir. Gathering what strength she could, she pressed her palms flat on his chest, blocking out the noise of her protesting heart, and pushed away, stumbling to the floor. He attempted to help her up, but she swatted his hands away. No, she cried out firmly. She got up unsteadily, and bringing a hand to wipe the tears that fell, she turned and ran out of the gazebo, forcing her legs to carry her as far away from him as possible. His voice lifted into the air as he called out to her, her name sounding as sweet as wine to her ears, and his hand was stretched out to reach for her, but she had fled too quickly. Ellenmeyer. No, Legolas, no, she whimpered, and she ran blindly, turning this way and that, uncaring of where she would end up, as long as she put as much distance between herself and Legolas. She had no idea how she had let it get so out of control, but she already decided on one thing, she would not tell Boromir. She turned a corner and a sudden impact with something solid nearly caused her to fall backwards, but 2 steady arms wrapped around her to catch her before she fell. She trembled in his embrace, the familiar scent of him drifting into her nostrils. Boromir, she cried softly, raising her eyes to look into his face. Dearest heart, what is it that ails you? He asked in alarm, holding her closer to him, and she wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his chest. Just hold me please, she sobbed. No, I will never hurt him, she promised herself vehemently. Never again, Legolas, will I allow myself to fall under your spell. Boromir rocked her softly as her tears subsided, but their hold on each other never waned. When she was finally calm, he said nothing, but bent down and slid one arm under her knees with his other arm cradling her back as he swept her up and carried her to her room. Anaril was surprised to see her lady in the arms of the man of Gondor in such a manner, but she said not one word as he lay her on her bed. He moved to leave, but she turned her head to face him and grabbed a hold of his hand. No, Boromir, stay, she said softly, and Anaril let out an astonished gasp, but said nothing. His eyes softened as he looked down into Ellenmire's tear-streaked face and nodded, and Anaril placed a hand over her chest, taking deep breaths. Yes, I will be back in a few minutes, he replied just as quietly. Anaril will change you into your sleepwear in the meantime. He nodded in Anaril's direction and walked out of the door, closing it quietly behind him. The handmaiden did not utter one word of protest, nor did she scold, seeing how frail Ellenmire now looked. Her light was almost completely diminished, and she could not help but wonder at what would have caused such a thing to happen just when her glow was beginning to grow back to its former bright state. She changed Ellenmire quickly and slipped out of the door just as Boromir approached in his attire, and she averted her eyes from his as she nodded in acquiescence for him to enter. Ellenmire, he whispered as he approached the bed, and she turned to him, holding out her hand to take his. Hold me, Boromir, she uttered, and he crept into the bed behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against him. I am sorry to have worried you. There is no need for an apology, love, he murmured into her ear. Only when you feel comfortable enough to discuss it will I ask for you to disclose to me what has upset you so. I will not force you to explain everything to me now. She sighed. Thank you, he responded by gently leaving a kiss on the tender skin of her neck. His soothing act of affection nearly brought tears to her eyes once more at her foolish lack of self-control. She changed the subject quickly to keep from sobbing again. So did you ever find out from Elrohir and Elladan of what the scouts have discovered during their excursion? He cleared his throat, and she felt him nod against her hair. There was no trace of the Black Riders anywhere, though 3 of their horses have been found drowned at the flooded ford, he informed her. Gandalf hopes now that the ringwraiths are scattered, so the Fellowship must leave quickly. The enemy, of course, has other servants, but Gandalf believes that if we leave now, by the time they reach the borders of Rivendell to pick up our trail, we will be long gone. She shivered at the news and he held on tighter to her. Lord Elrond has declared that we leave in 7 days' time. So soon, her heart dropped at the words. In a week, she would be gone from the only home she had ever known, leaving behind a wonderful foster family that she loved with almost her entire being. She had to choke back a sob that arose in her chest, and Boromir kissed her cheek softly. Shish, love, he pacified. You must rest. She felt her body relaxing as he held her closer to his warmth, and soon, before her eyes glazed over with sleep, she heard him whisper, I love you, Ellenmire. The ring goes south. 7 days and nights passed far too quickly for Ellenmire, and she suddenly found herself dressed in her usual tunic, leggings and a heavy cloak lined with fur as she prepared to depart with the rest of the Fellowship and Mary Sue. It was still dark, but Lord Elrond had suggested that they leave and travel only under the cover of darkness until they were safely away from Rivendell, for they knew not what creatures and spies the Dark Lord had said about them. As they stood in the great hall by the fire, they listened anxiously to Elrond, who informed them that the journey to destroy the ring was Frodo's and his alone, and those of the Fellowship who wished to tarry or return could do so. Faithless is he that says farewell when the road darkens, Gimli the dwarf muttered, voicing the opinion of every single person of the Fellowship. Ellenmire felt her eyes tear up as she looked to her father, not knowing whether it would be the last time she would ever see him or hear his voice again. As Bilbo bid his farewell to them all, she reached for her father, who took her in his embrace, holding her close to him, and she heard his voice quaver. Fare thee well, my daughter, he said softly. Amin Mela yea, I love you, she whispered in response, but never did she allow her tears to fall, wishing to remain strong even though her heart was breaking. Her eyes studied his face, as if trying to memorize every minute detail, knowing that it would be many moons before she would ever see his reassuring face again, or if. I love you, too, dearest daughter, he said, his features finally showing signs of his worry and sadness, and she closed her eyes to lock the sound of his voice into her heart. They finally released each other, and she turned away, knowing that if she stayed any longer, she would revoke her vow to follow Frodo. Her heart was throbbing with an ache that she had only once before experienced when her mother had been taken away, but now the pain was once again as fresh as the morning dew. She had to leave and leave quickly. She did not know how much longer she could take it before she would rush back into the safety of the quiet halls of Rivendell. Boromir clasped her hand tightly as he lifted an object, the horn of Gondor, to his lips, before blowing into it, sending a final goodbye to the last homely home, and the strength of his hand on hers gave her some courage. There were some who stood on the terraces, their faces engulfed in the shadow of the night, but Ellenmire could distinguish 2 distinct, identical figures, each with a hand raised in a sorrowful farewell. Once again, the pang in her heart resurfaced, and she struggled to choke back a cry. Tears were brimming under her lids, but she held them back, despite the sting they so readily provided. Goodbye, my beloved brothers, she whispered into the air as the company began to depart, and without another word, she followed the 10 in front of her. With Gandalf leading and Aragorn by his side, the fellowship made their way across the bridge and up the winding, steep paths, continuing into the night. They traveled to the fort of Bruinen before leaving the main road, stumbling upon the narrow paths of the folded land. They would keep to the west of the misty mountains for 40 days, and they knew the journey would be a cold one. With each step, Ellenmeyer was leaving her only sanctuary behind, but the constant presence of the one who had controlled her heart and mind was one of the two main reasons she continued, the other being the far more important one of saving Middle-earth. But discreetly glancing to her side, her eyes softened as they looked upon Legolas, and she knew that she would follow him to the very fires of Mordor. Nothing was going to keep her away from him, even if she could not allow that very fact to be public knowledge. Being the elves that they were, Ellenmeyer and Legolas brought up the back of the company as the rearguard, their keen eyesight a valuable tool for defense, but because of the interlude between them the week before, they remained silent, knowing exactly what to say to the other, but not trusting themselves to speak the words that were dying to flow free from their lips. Boromir would look back at them now and then, as would Mary Sue, but neither could understand the booming silence between the two elves. Of course, traveling beside the hobbits in the center of the parade proved to be a comforting distraction, and it wasn't until they stopped to rest that they would question the elves, but neither would receive a fair answer. Ellenmeyer was adamant on never letting Boromir know of what had come to pass between herself and Legolas, and it seemed the Prince of Mirkwood also silently agreed, for he never spoke one word of it to anyone, despite the constant whining of Mary Sue. After a fortnight, the weather suddenly changed, and the sun made its appearance as the clouds dissolved into a beautiful light blue sky. The company reached a ridge surrounded by ancient holly trees just as they wearily paused from their long night march to admire the awakening dawn. On this ridge, they rested, each spending the break the way they saw fit. Gandalf was perched atop a boulder, a pipe in his mouth with halos of smoke hovering just above his head. After breakfast, a mere snack, Pippin had grumbled, the hobbits were putting their sword-fighting skills to the test as they sparred with Boromir, and Aragorn, Ellenmeyer and Mary Sue watched on in quiet amusement. Legolas stood still, looking into the distance, and Gimli son of Gloin mumbled incoherently by his side. Ellenmeyer could see Legolas perfectly with her peripheral vision, taking in the graceful movements of his lithe body as he leapt upon boulders, scanning the land and sky for any possible danger. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and she knew she could no longer deny to whom her heart responded. Their kiss was proof enough of that, and each and every time she thought of it, her heart soared with the freedom she had always longed for but had never grasped until the moment their lips had met in that sweet kiss. She felt her cheeks flushing, and she quickly scolded herself, forcing her eyes to focus on Boromir, and Boromir alone. They were in love, yes, but was it true love? Her eyes glazed over with admiration as she studied the proud, fair face of the man of Gondor, a face that was fixed in concentration as he taught swings and blocks to the small hobbits, and it warmed her heart to see how wonderful he was to the tiniest two of her friends, Merry and Pippin. They were of short stature, and her imagination began to run wild. With Boromir towering over them, it seemed as if he were playing with children, and Ellenmeyer smiled quietly, a visual drifting into her head of Boromir training their children one day to be fine warriors. The image made her eyes light up with a sort of happiness, yet, she did not feel complete, and the smile that had played upon her lips slowly faded away. Ah! Pippin cried out in pain, shaking Ellenmeyer out of her daydreams, and her eyes shot to the small hobbit's face which was distorted with the mixed emotions of hurt and frustration. Oh, sorry, Boromir sputtered in disbelief, dropping his sword to kneel to Pippin's side, but the young took shot out his leg and tripped the man to the ground. Ellenmeyer clutched at her stomach as her laughter held her captive, and she snorted even louder as Mary joined the fray, crying out, "For the Shire!" The three wrestled on the floor, and Ellenmeyer composed herself long enough to gently tug her love away from the playfully angry grips of her two friends, and they scowled up at her. Ellenmeyer, no fair, Pippin protested. We were just getting started. I do prefer to have my love in one piece, thank you, she laughed, and Boromir twirled her in his arms, before placing a kiss on her lips. A single guilty thought raced through her head, and she hated herself even more at that moment. I wish I could kiss Legolas again. However, the thought itself must have translated through her rather chaste kiss, for Boromir pulled away sharply, his eyes narrowing, and he looked down at her to study her face as a look of confusion covered his. Ellenmeyer felt her heart nearly stop its pounding when Boromir's facial features contorted to hurt and suspicion, and she pulled him close, praying that her guilt was not displayed so blatantly on her countenance. "Oh holy Elbereth, please let him not suspect." The hobbits stared at them dejectedly, but they had no time to wallow, for Samwise's question put a chill through their veins. "What's that?" he asked, staring off into the horizon where a dark gray cloud of something was flying toward them. "It is just a wisp of clouds," Gimli declared, placing his hands on his hips in irritation. Boromir shook his head. "It's moving fast, against the wind," Boromir argued, his eyes growing wide, and Ellenmeyer pulled out of his grasp, trying to deny what her eyes were telling her. Creebane from Dunland, Legolas confirmed with a hiss, and Ellenmeyer felt a tug at her hand and found herself looking into the wide eyes of Pippin. She nodded, and together, they ducked under some foliage where Boromir and Merry were already waiting for them. Her eyes urgently scanned the ridge and breathed a sigh of relief upon spotting Legolas' white blonde head lying patiently under a thorn bush, and for a minute, she was brought back to the memories of his eavesdropping antics. Their relationship had been so innocent then, but it had all changed in one forbidden, stolen moment, and she knew with all her being that it was he whom she had been waiting for. But as an arm snaked around her waist to hold her close to a steady, strong body, she was reminded of why they could never act on impulse ever again. Boromir's heart was beating wildly against her back, and she settled closer to him, but his fear for both of their lives was apparent in the tremble of his hand as it held hers. They all lay silent, but her eyes never strayed from the spot where Legolas lay, and despite the seriousness of the situation at hand, jealousy flared when she noticed Mary Sue sneaking her way to his side, snuggling under his arm. She had no time to dwell on her anger, for it was quickly wiped out of her mind as soon as the dark birds came streaking across the air above them. Their awful screeching pained her sensitive ears, and instinctively, she curled closer to Boromir, who gladly offered his warmth. His arms wrapped protectively around her, much tighter than usual. The harsh thrashing of wings joined the terrible cacophony, and Ellenmeyer gritted her teeth, desperately trying to cover her ears from the tortuous sounds. Merry and Pippin quivered beside her, and she wished with all her being that she could have been more comforting for them, but even she could not stop the coldness that had possessed her body. The roughness of the rocks underneath her were digging into her sides, and she tried desperately not to shift for fear of drawing attention to themselves. The birds slowly descended away, and the company crawled out of their hiding places, sweating and breathing hard. Spies of Saruman, Gandalf sneered angrily. The passage south is being watched. We must take the pass of Caradhras. Pippin's face paled as they all turned to stare up at the tall, snowy peak and shivered involuntarily. Worry not, Pip, Ellenmeyer uttered softly as they all gathered their things, but her words were unconvincing even to her own ears. He gave her a feeble smile and moved to his place in the middle of the company as they followed the old wizard to meet the great knees of the mountains. The air around them grew thin and cold, and the elves sadly studied the others who had begun to quaver at winter's penetrating caresses. Legolas had said not one word to Ellenmeyer the moment their journey had begun, and every single second was nothing short of torture. There were so many words that he needed to tell her, that he needed to say, and keeping them inside was driving himself insane. As he and Ellenmeyer lightly traveled over the snow while the others trekked through it, he observed her seemingly emotionless face, knowing that it was nothing more than a mask. There were instances when her real emotions broke free across her facial features, but only his quick elven eyes could catch them. He had seen her worry when her eyes had darted across the space between them when the Creebane had made their appearance, but he had dared not lift his head to reassure her at that time. He knew the black birds could detect the slightest movement, but what was more terrifying was that if he had in fact turned to look at her only to watch her cling to Boromir, the sight would have torn his poor heart into shambles, and he would have rather faced multiple battles against orcs than to face another moment without her. Their kiss was not a mistake, and the memory gnawed at his heart ever since it had happened. He should have kissed her a long time ago, he was certain, for he felt his destiny in the feel of her lips pressed against his, and he knew he was now paying for his conflicting emotions. But he was determined to say no more, not until the time was right. They had a mission to do, and he was not going to make the journey more increasingly tense than it already was by putting his love for her before his commitment to the fellowship. He gulped. Love? Had he actually thought that? He shook the unnecessary question out of his head because the answer was obvious enough. Yes, his love for her was always there, and but for his questioning mind, his heart knew it all along. He had been acting strange the past couple of months because he needed to remain focused on their mission ahead, but whenever Ellenmeyer was by him, his thoughts turned into mud, and he could no longer remember what task he had been occupied with mere seconds before she came near. Now that they were finally on their way to Mount Doom, he needed to push her out of his mind, but it was nearly impossible when she was always right there, so close that if he lifted his hand, he could easily stroke her face. He could feel it within his very soul that if he ever touched her again, he would never let her go, and now was not the time for such things. But will that time ever come, or was he grasping on to flimsy hopes? Step by step, they trailed after the others, keeping close watch on the areas surrounding them. Her light breathing was like music to his ears, and he relished the sound of her soft sigh that came every so often just before she would turn to briefly glance at him. Her habit had become so routine that when the company finally stopped to rest, he turned his head to look at her just as her sigh escaped her lips. Their eyes locked. There was a tumultuous storm of emotions raging within her misty grays, but the rest of her face remained impassive. She bit onto her bottom lip, but he forced his body to remain still, suppressing the urge to take her right then and there and make love to her in the soft whiteness of the snow. Holy Valar, how he wanted her, to feel her comforting presence in his arms, especially now when each living moment had much more value to him. She opened her mouth and spoke, her eyes glistening with sadness. I am sorry. Legolas blinked. It took several seconds for the words to finally register, and the corners of his lips pulled downward. She was sorry. But why? That kiss never should have happened, she continued quietly, answering his unspoken question. Because of it, we hardly communicate. The least we can do is talk to each other in order to help the fellowship to the best of our abilities. If we do not amend our mistakes, then we will be of no use to them. It was no mistake, he said just as softly. But I agree. I, too, apologize, only for causing you discomfort, but I will not be sorry for what did come to pass between us that night. She shook her head, sighing even more heavily. Nothing happened, she stated firmly, her gray eyes challenging his, and despite the hostility in them, his heart leapt at the fire that burned within her spirit. Very well, he said, and her jaw dropped slightly in shock, as if she had been waiting for him to counter with some sort of argument, but he knew he never wanted to cause her grief again. For a moment, her facade melted, and the insecurity behind her words were evident, and he did the only thing he could think of to comfort her without finding himself at the receiving end of the swings of Boromir's sword. He smiled. Ellenmeyer blinked. Legolas was not fighting her as she had expected he would, as he had in the past. He merely accepted her denial, but his easy acquiescence unnerved her even more than if he had argued and had caused a scene. It made her apprehensive about her quick words because they deceived him, and yet if he knew, it seemed he did not mind. However, as always, there was a situation with the rest of the group that provided an easy exit away from the awkwardness she was feeling with Legolas's sudden about-face, but her heart dropped as she veered her attention to Frodo who stood beside Aragorn, and the rightful king of Gondor was poised to attack Boromir. In spite of this, Boromir seemed oblivious for there in his gloved hands was the chain that held the One Ring. What is he doing? Her mind screamed frantically, and she and Legolas lightly crossed to Aragorn's side. Frodo's attire was covered with snow, and it was apparent that he had tumbled, accidentally freeing the ring from his neck in the process. Boromir, she cried out, her voice sounding frail against the gust of the wind that danced through the atmosphere. Her eyes darted to Aragorn's face, and her heart pounded with nervousness to see the look of wrath upon his fair features. She held her breath. Boromir responded not, but gazed ever steadily into the gleaming golden band. As her own eyes darted to the ring, time suddenly stood still. She slowly became so transfixed that Boromir's words barely reached her keen ears. The ring was beautiful, stunning. The faint sunlight danced upon the strips of the red, gold and bronze colors that played upon its smooth exterior, and Ellenmeyer felt her eyelids droop a bit and slowly lifted her hand, as if to reach out for it. Just one touch. All she wanted was one touch to feel the sleekness beneath her fingertips. She was losing herself to the call of the ring's seduction. It is a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing, Boromir whispered. Such a little thing. Boromir. Aragorn boomed, snapping both Boromir and Ellenmeyer out of their trances, and she glanced up guilty at Legolas. She was surprised. There upon his face as well was a look of remorse that she knew covered her own. Their eyes locked once more, but she averted her gaze away to study Boromir, only to see him hesitating. Boromir, Aragorn repeated steadily and his hand gripped the hilt of his sword. Give the ring to Frodo. Boromir stood frozen to the spot, trying to shake his head free from the hold the ring had had on him, but Mary Sue sighed with exasperation, crossing the snow to him. Snatching the chain out of his hand, she handed it daintily back to Frodo before whipping around to glare angrily at Boromir. Now that wasn't that hard, was it? She growled in frustration, folding her arms. All you had to do was give it to the little guy. I don't see what was so grueling about. Damn you, leave him alone. Ellenmeyer snapped, her face flushed with rage. Her hands were clutched into fists, and she marched right into Mary Sue's face. What kind of creature was she to so nonchalantly handle a ring of power? Do you not see how difficult it is to resist the call of the ring? What sort of a demon are you? Surely, you must be one of the Dark Lord's own to possess a will strong enough to resist the pure evil of his creation. Ellenmeyer, please, it is over, Boromir said quietly, his head hanging slightly in shame. Still, her shoulders shook with fury, and her eyes screamed curses at the girl who still cowered in her presence. Ellenmeyer was far from done with her. Don't you ever dare act as if you are better than him again, do you understand me? She sneered, her lip curled in disgust. Whatever, Mary Sue grumbled, still unable to meet Ellenmeyer's dark gaze. It's his own fault for holding on to it for so long anyway. The rest of her sentence was cut off as Ellenmeyer's hand found contact with her cheek in a quick, satisfying slap. Oh, how wonderful it felt. But, deep inside, Ellenmeyer knew she had reacted far too quickly, even if Mary Sue's behavior toward Boromir was unacceptable. Her frustration with her conflicting emotions for both Legolas and Boromir were kept bottled inside, and Mary Sue had easily become her scapegoat. Mary Sue stumbled a few steps from the momentum, and her eyes were wide with shock. There was a red imprint spread widely on her left cheek, and against the whiteness of the snow, it glowed even more brightly in contrast. Guilt flooded the she-elf, but she was not about to show it, and instead, opted for covering her guilt with anger. I was your instructor for 2 months, and you had shown signs of potential, Ellenmeyer spat, shaking her head. If I need to slap some sense into that empty brain of yours throughout this entire trip, I will not hesitate. She shook her head again before turning away. Well, the statement did make sense. We're a fellowship, Mary Sue cried out. You're not supposed to hit me. And you are not supposed to berate another for doing what is difficult to overcome, Ellenmeyer snapped, her eyes flashing. Another wonderful point. She silently congratulated herself for her quick thinking. I had taught you a lesson before, and believe me, I would not vacillate to do such a thing again. You still have much to learn. Ellenmeyer, that is not necessary, Boromir said more forcefully, and her head snapped quickly to look at him, unable to wipe away the surprised look of hurt from her face at his obvious disagreement with her behavior. It is over. There is no need for more hostility. She crossed her arms in silent protestation, but she drew her lips to a line and gave a stiff nod before turning away. The rest of the company was struck silent at the quickly escalating tension within the group, but no more was said that day about the incident, although Mary Sue's soft whining could be heard, and many pitied Legolas for the unfortunate position in being her main confidant. However, Gimli came to Legolas' rescue whenever her complaints became too much to handle, and he was a comic relief to the elf whenever the young girl fell asleep from exhaustion, and it was the friendly banter between the two that helped keep the Prince of Mirkwood sane. The fellowship continued on their journey up across the mountain, and it was becoming difficult for them to breathe as the air was growing thinner. Snow was starting to fall heavily around them as the sharp wind bit at their faces, much to the annoyance of everyone other than the elves, and the path that barely clung to the side of the mountain was shrinking away to a tiny strip. One false step could lead to a sharp drop into oblivion. Suddenly, large frozen chunks of snow and rock began to fall upon them, and they pressed against the mountain's side for protection, all except for Legolas and Ellenmeyer, who had both easily run upon the snow to the edge of the cliff, for they had heard a strange sound drifting into their sensitive ears. There is a fell voice on the air. Legolas cried out to the rest of the company, and Ellenmeyer nodded, her heart pounding crazily at the evil electricity she could feel in the atmosphere. Yes, it sounds like chanting, she began. It's Saruman, Gandalf yelled in conclusion. He's trying to bring down the mountain. Aragorn exclaimed in disbelief. Gandalf, we must turn back. No, the wizard screamed in defiance, lifting his staff and muttering words to appease Caradhras. Ellenmeyer looked desperately to Legolas in confusion, not knowing what to do. A streak of lightning flashed in the sky, its fiery end blasting the rocks just above them, and Ellenmeyer found herself losing her balance as the large boulders fell upon the company, followed by an avalanche of pressed snow that fell so quickly that she had no time to react or regain her footing. An unnatural scream escaped her lips as she was tumbling forward, but a pair of strong arms grabbed a hold of her. Legolas pulled her to him just in time as the snow completely buried them all. Her eyes opened at the silence that had so rapidly covered her and found herself wrapped in Legolas's arms, and thick layers of snow walled them off from the others. She lifted her head up, and her gaze caught his. She had been so close to dropping over the edge, so close to meeting her death. You're not hurt? He asked, his brow creased with worry as his fingertips softly stroked her cheek. She shook her head, unable to find her voice to answer him, and she mimicked his movements instead. The cold skin of his face was soft and smooth beneath her fingers, and despite the snow that had enveloped them, she was filled with warmth. He closed his eyes as if to relish her gentle caress, and she choked back a cry, wanting to stay in his arms but hating the situation that had brought them there. Fate had a twisted sense of humor, and it seemed it loved to play its cruelest jokes on her. No, Legolas, I'm not hurt, she said, finally finding her voice, and her lips trembled. I was close to falling, but if you hadn't caught me, there was pain written plainly across her face. Ellenmeyer, Legolas muttered, his voice strangled. He had been so close to losing her, so close to losing his heart, and his eyes conveyed an emotion he knew he had to profess before it was too late. Ellenmeyer, Amin Malaye, I love you. He pulled her closer to him and gently spoke into her ear. The road is growing far more dangerous, and I would not dare take another step without telling you how I feel. Situations have delayed my confession for far too long, but before anything else can happen, you must know of my feelings for you whether you like it or not. I love you, oh holy Valar, how I love you. Her eyes had grown wide, her jaw dropped slightly, and all she could do was stare at the elf who had captured her heart the moment she had first seen him. He was saying the words that she had craved to hear from him for the longest time, but now that they were spoken, she felt boundless joy and despair at the same moment. Tears glistened in her eyes as she shook her head, but he paid no heed to her protest, for his lips devoured hers. It was not the same as the tentative first kiss that they had shared nearly a month or so before. Fiery passion took a hold of both of them, and he was drinking her in, uniting their souls as he tasted her. He lightly nipped at her bottom lip with his teeth before claiming her tongue with his, and her moans, "Oh Elbreth, help him," her moans were driving him to the point of no return. Her fingers were lightly caressing his ears, sending a shiver through every single nerve of his body, and as he stroked the softness of her neck with his butterfly kisses, he could tell he had the same effect on her. "You are mine, Ellenmeyer," he growled as they broke away from each other, and his eyes darkened with determination. "I will not lose you again." But what about Boromir?" she objected helplessly, just as part of the snowy surface gave away, allowing a ray of dim light into their momentary sanctuary. A face peered down at them, and a hand soon followed to help pull them out. "Ellenmeyer." "The face," Boromir exclaimed, grabbing a hold of her as she wiggled out, and Legolas effortlessly followed after her. Boromir had his arms wrapped around her by the time Legolas had pulled himself out, and the elf scowled angrily in their direction, which Boromir did not bother to notice. "I am fine," she tried reassuring him, but he did not ease his hold on her. "I had thought that you had gone over the edge," he choked. "My heart was overcome with grief to think that the last words that I had spoken to you had hurt you in." "Boromir, I am fine," she repeated fervently. "What is more important is that we get off this mountain immediately." She bit her bottom lip and lowered her voice only so that he could hear her. "And, as soon as we do, we must converse." Her eyes flicked to Legolas, her heart pounding. She knew what she had to do. "Yes, of course," he readily agreed, smiling, but she was sure he did not understand her intended point. "There is much to say, so much more to say." He looked to the others as did she, and spoke urgently. "We must get off this mountain, make for the Gap of Rohan and take the west road to my city. The Gap of Rohan takes us too close to Isengard," Aragorn argued. "If we cannot pass over the mountain, let us go under it." Gimli cried out, his eyes lighting up with excitement at the possibility. "Let us go through the mines of Moria." Both Ellenmeyer and Legolas visibly shook. Mines were dark, and more importantly, away from even the faintest hint of starlight. Ellenmeyer did not know exactly what it was to be without light, and the very thought of it scared her senseless. She looked to Gandalf, silently pleading with him to look for another alternative. Anything was better than the shadows of a mine. "Let the ringbearer decide," Gandalf finally declared, and all eyes were turned to Frodo. He lay huddled next to Aragorn. He stared about him, shocked at first, then sighing in resignation. "We will go through the mines," he stated clearly, and Gandalf closed his eyes before gazing out to the rest of the company and nodding. "So be it." The bridge of Khazad-dûm. Gimli was by Gandalf's side with wide, eager eyes as they approached the looming mountainsides, dark with shadows. "The walls of Moria," he stammered in awe, and with quick feet, he rushed ahead while the others felt their hearts sinking. It was a desolate place. There were no signs of life, no sounds of running water as Gandalf had expected. Ellenmeyer shuddered, not from the cold, but from the growing sense of unease that was eating at her instinct. She wanted to flee from the horrible place. Gimli looked back to the company from far ahead as he pointed to their right. There was a narrow channel of nothing save a few brown and red-colored rocks and stones, and beside it lay a ruined path that curved around with the mountain wall. Finally, Gandalf sighed with a nod of his head. "This is where the Saranen, the Gate Stream, had run. This place has indeed changed, for I know not where the water may now be." They found the reason soon enough when a dull, lusterless lake greeted them, blocking their path to the elven door at the end of the road from Hollin, and knew they had to find a way around it. They continued on the main path, though it was dark under the mountain's shadow, and it grew steep and narrow. The company traveled ever farther, following Gimli as the path grew slimy from the water, and their footing was unstable. A foot would slip now and then, and everyone, especially the hobbits, hated the feel of the unclean water touching their weary feet. Two large holly trees that loomed over them as they drew nearer, pressed against the mountain walls and stretching its roots into the dark water, and Gandalf turned around to inform the rest of the company. "We are here at last," he said. "This is the elven way from Hollin." Those were happier days, when there was still close friendship at times between folk of different race, even between dwarves and elves. "It was not the fault of the dwarves that the friendship waned," Gimli immediately replied, placing his hands on his hips arrogantly. "Humph. I have not heard it was the fault of the elves," scoffed Legolas, his eyes flashing, and Ellenmeyer bit back a smile, not wanting to irritate the dwarf. Despite the war of words that always battled between the two, Legolas and Gimli were slowly growing closer, and the bond of friendship already had a stable foundation to build upon. "Athildon," Gandalf muttered carefully, wiping away dirt from the wall to uncover a bit of the door's pattern. "It mirrors only moonlight and starlight." Ellenmeyer looked up into the night sky, her eyes glowing as the moon shyly peeked through the dark gray clouds. Oh, how she hated the thought of leaving the moonlight behind once inside the mines. She shuddered and looked away to the wall, which now had the shimmering outline of a door plastered on its surface. Her jaw dropped slightly. It was beyond beautiful. There, emblazoned within the pattern was an arch of interlacing elvish characters, and below it were an anvil and a hammer surmounted by a crown and 7 stars. Beneath these were 2 trees, each bearing crescent moons, but the most dominant feature was the star in the center of the door that shone with many rays. The emblems of Durin, Gimli uttered, flabbergasted. There is the tree of the high elves. Legolas exclaimed. And the star of the house of Fëanor, Gandalf informed. The lettering reads, the doors of Durin, Lord of Moria. Speak, friend, and enter. What do you suppose that means? Merry inquired, his eyes still wide at the sight of the Ithildan entrance. It's quite simple, Gandalf explained. If you are a friend, you speak the password of it, and the doors will open. Pressing his staff to the star in the center, he muttered in a clear voice, Anan Edhelen, Edro Hi Amen. Gate of the elves, open now for me. They waited. Silence. Gimli looked impatiently at the wizard as he repeated the words, but nothing happened, and sighing, Ellenmeyer made herself comfortable as she leaned lazily against one of the trees. If Gandalf did not know how to get in, how would they? It would be a long night. Boromir approached her, and she grew uneasy once more. She loved him, and she did not want to hurt him, but she was dying inside to be deceiving him the way she was. Legolas caught her eye and nodded in encouragement, giving her a lopsided smile which instantly melted the anxiety in her heart, and she recalled the words that he had said to her when they had been buried underneath snow, the words that had so much passion and love behind them. I love you, O holy Valar, how I love you, you are mine, Ellenmeyer. How was she supposed to face Boromir now? As he gently took her hand in his before bestowing a loving kiss on her palm, she debated whether or not this was the time to do such a thing, to tell him the truth. But there never was going to be a perfect time to do it, she realized, because no matter where or when she would tell him, the result would be the same. Boromir was bound to be heartbroken. Boromir, she started, but he shushed her with a kiss. She grew stiff and immobile, and he pulled away again, the hurt that had before crossed his features now on display once more. What is it that ails you? He asked softly, not attempting to hide the pain from his voice. When I reach for you now, you freeze, as if you no longer want this, as if you no longer want me. She bit her lip and felt the words come up her throat, but she was choking them back. His fair face was contorted with denial, and yet, there was a slight tremble on his lips that almost gave the impression that he knew was about to happen. Oh, gods, I cannot do this. Ellenmeyer thought frantically, her eyes quickly shooting to Legolas for support, but he was not paying attention. In fact, he was rather occupied at the moment with a certain human girl who had managed to lean against him. He looked rather uncomfortable, but why, in Elbereth's name, did he not just push her away? Has he taken to the halflings, weed? Her heart cried out. What does he think he is doing? She turned back to Boromir and looked deeply into his eyes. The poor man was confused, torn, and completely at a loss as to what to say or what to do to show his love for her. All this she could see on his face, and she lifted her hand to smooth away the lines of worry that troubled him. His eyes closed at her touch, and she felt a sob rising in her throat but suppressed it. She could not hurt this man who had given his love to her without question, without pause. He had loved her and had shown it, while it took Legolas a near-death experience to confess his heart, and how did she know he did not say those things out of pity or out of guilt at what had passed between them that night under the gazebo? She glanced back over to Legolas who still remained in his spot by Mary Sue, who in turn was delighted at his attention. Legolas really had nothing to lose while Ellenmeyer did. Not only would she lose Boromir's love, she would also be at the receiving end of Mary Sue's anger, and although she would not admit this to anyone, Ellenmeyer did not want to deal with her again for Mary Sue was beginning to show signs of a truly strong warrior, and Ellenmeyer was not sure she could even defeat the girl in battle. The prophecy was beginning to take root. Boromir's eyes opened to study her face, and she softened almost immediately. She loved Boromir, and would not dare to think of hurting him. Legolas had his chance, and she was not going to let him be the reason for throwing away the love that she and Boromir shared. If they were to break apart from each other, it would not be because she wanted another. She was not about to give Legolas that much credit. Still, she spoke not one word, and the worry returned to Boromir's face. Please, love, what is it that troubles you? He asked softly but urgently, and she smiled softly, touched with his concern for her. She swept a strand of hair away from his face and tucked it behind his ear, loving the silkiness of his hair between her fingertips. The same thing that troubles the rest of the company, she answered softly. Never did I imagine that this journey would be as terrifying as it has been, and lately, I've been wondering about how horrible it will grow to be. It unnerves me. She settled in his arms, and he accepted her answer without question. I had nearly lost my heart when I had thought you had gone over the cliff, he whispered, shuddering. And I realized that I cannot live my life without you, so I must make this official, before another word is spoken. Her head snapped up, and she stared at him, her heart thumping madly. She felt her face drain itself of color, and her ability to breathe had somehow become more laborious than normal. What do you mean, exactly? She questioned, her voice barely audible. He took both of her hands in his and placed them near his heart, and she could instantly feel the crazy aerobics it was performing. This may not be the most romantic spot to do such a thing, he started nervously, but, Ellenmeyer, I love you, and I know I do not have the gift of sweet words, but I ask you to bless me with the joy of calling you my wife. Please, say you will marry me. Her jaw dropped further than she thought possible. Why hadn't she seen this coming? The signs were so obvious, especially after he had rescued her from the snow. She could not speak, she could not indicate her answer with a nod or a shake of her head, for she was frozen stiff. Boromir started to shift on his feet, and his hands gripped tightly on hers. His voice shook when he spoke, insecurity grabbing a hold of him. Ellenmeyer. Yes, she blabbered, and then shook her head before closing her eyes and breathing deeply. This is what she wanted, was it not? All those lonely nights, all those years of solitude were now being swept away with his promise of marriage. She had found someone who loved her and actually wanted to marry her, and she had prayed to the Valar for so long, and she was not one to throw away a gift that they had so generously provided her with. She reopened her eyes and smiled softly at him. What I mean to say is, yes. Yes, I will. Boromir broke out into a wide smile as he engulfed her in his arms, and he buried his face in the crook of her neck, whispering how much he loved her. Tears were on his face as well as on hers, and from afar, Legolas watched the scene, nodding, noticing only the tears at first. So she has told him then, he said softly to himself, but, what was that? A smile on his face. Boromir is taking this better than I had thought he would, he mused silently, but when Ellenmeyer locked eyes with Legolas and shook her head in his direction, he felt a foreboding sense of dread. He took another look at Boromir and distinguished the wide smile on his face as one drawn from happiness. What is going on? He mused in a panic, and he looked down at Mary Sue, who had started to babble about something called movies. Excuse me, Mary Sue, he said, keeping his voice steady, but I am going to see what their celebration is all about. He gestured to Ellenmeyer and Boromir, and Mary Sue scowled. But this is important, she started, but he had turned without saying another word, giving her his back. She quickly chased after him, though with his elven speed, he had already reached the couple. Mary Sue arrived in time to hear a single word escape Legolas's surprised lips. Betrothed, he uttered in complete disbelief, his hurt blatantly displayed on his face, which went unnoticed by all save Ellenmeyer. His heart was still denying the words that Boromir had stammered in elation. Mary Sue was jumping up and down. Oh, how wonderful, she squealed, clapping her hands. Her eyes immediately went to Legolas and she wrapped an arm around his waist, leaning her head against his chest. He made no move to push her away, but instead, he was filled with an unspeakable anger and urge to hurt Ellenmeyer any way he could, and his arm found its way around Mary Sue's shoulders to hold her closer. He smiled at Ellenmeyer, but his blue eyes were ice cold like glaciers, and his gaze burned her far worse than the hottest of fires. That it is, he said calmly, reaching out his other hand to Boromir. Congratulations. Ellenmeyer's tears rolled down her face at his reaction, wanting to be back in Imladris, away from the two males who had such an impact on her life. Wondering about what love was far more endurable than experiencing the pain that had started to throb in heart at the ache she was causing Legolas at that moment. Oh, Elbereth, please let him forgive me. She silently prayed, hoping her apology was visible in her eyes as they locked with his. He turned away from her, a sneer on his lips, refusing to look into her eyes again. All the while, Gandalf was still futilely trying all the passwords that had come to mind. He had now resorted to yelling, Edro, Edro. Or open, open, and Aragorn looked dismally at Sam as he began to unload their packs from Bill's back. The mines are no place for a pony, Aragorn said softly, not even one so brave as Bill. Sam bit his lip to prevent from crying out, though tears stung beneath his eyelids. His hand trembled as he gave Bill one last pat. Bye, Bill, he stammered unevenly, his chest heaving with sadness. He turned away as Bill continued back down the path that they had taken. Aragorn clasped Sam's shoulder in reassurance. Don't worry, Sam, he soothed. He knows the way home. Being the active hobbits they were, Merry and Pippin had started to throw rocks into the eerily placid lake, and Aragorn rushed to them, stopping their motions. Do not disturb the water, he warned urgently. The ripples that had been caused by the thrown stones were now growing suspiciously larger, and Pippin's eyes filled with silent fear as he stumbled away from the water's edge. It's a riddle, Frodo suddenly cried out excitedly. What's the Elvish word for friend? He looked at Gandalf expectantly, whose eyebrows went up in realization. Melon, he replied, and the walls began to crack open. In stunned amazement, the fellowship turned at the sound, and gazed in disbelief into the darkness that lay just beyond the door. Gandalf led the way, a light emitting from his staff, and Gimli eagerly followed him. Soon, Master Elf, you will enjoy the fabled hospitality of the dwarves. Gimli cried out to Legolas, who had followed just behind him, though with more hesitation than the dwarf. Roaring fires, malt beer, red meat off the bone. This, my friend, is the home of my cousin Balin. And they call it a mine. He chuckled heavily. A mine. Legolas, however, hardly acknowledged his words, his gaze only on Elendmire and Boromir, unable to stop the crying of his heart. Elendmire gripped Boromir's hand in trepidation as she stepped into the darkness, and she let out a gasp when she came face to face with a skeleton clad in mail and hung on a wall by a well-placed arrow through the heart. This is no mine, Boromir exclaimed, his foot crunching on bone. It's a tomb. Gandalf's light spread across the entrance hall, and Gimli's eyes widened at the sight before him. Strewn across the floor were mutilated skeletons of his kin, and arrows and axes were scattered across and through their bodies. The dust and cobwebs indicated that they had been in this condition for quite some time. No, Gimli groaned in horror. No. Legolas reached over to one of the bodies and pulled an arrow out of it to study its tip. Goblins, he sneered angrily, throwing the object to the floor before reaching for his own bow and arrow. Elendmire unsheathed her sword and gripped its hilt, and the faint moonlight that shone through the doorway reflected off her blade, giving her some comfort, but the idea of goblins gave her the chills. She edged toward the door. We make for the Gap of Rohan. Boromir urged. We never should have come here. Now get out of here, get out. Elendmire did a complete about-face, but was horrified to see that tentacles reached out to the hobbits. Ah! Frodo was suddenly airborne, held upside down by a slithery arm, and Sam ran after him, calling out. Strider! Sam's voice brought all the attention to the hobbits, and the two men, two elves, and dwarf rushed out, attacking and slicing at the dark creature's tentacles, but Frodo was suddenly free falling in the air. Aragorn had sliced the arm that had held him up, and Frodo fell directly into Boromir's awaiting arms, and they rushed back into the mine. The dark creature was not one to give up as it reached out to the doors, but the rock crumbled underneath its weight, and smashed the creature in place, trapping the fellowship inside. There was no light. Elendmire stood shivering in the darkness, close to breaking down. All she could hear was the hard breathing of those around her, and she tried to calm her own heart from the adrenaline that had consumed her body, but the darkness was deafening, she could not control her shaking. A warm body moved to her, and she clung to it, not caring who it was, but the familiar smell of wood and spice made her want to retract from Legolas. She pulled away slightly, but his arm held her to him, so severely that she nearly cried out in pain. Legolas, she whimpered, you're hurting me. He relaxed but never let her go. And you do the same to me, my love, he replied, and he was suddenly gone, leaving her to tremble alone in the darkness, the coldness of the mine contrasting sharply with the lingering warmth of his body pressed to hers. I'm sorry, she whispered, a lone tear trekking its way down her cheek, and was not at all aware that Legolas had heard her. Immediately, he felt himself constrict with guilt and moved toward her to take her back into his arms and apologize for his stupid pride, but Gandalf's staff suddenly came back to life with light, and Elendmire ran toward the old wizard, determined to stay as close to him as possible. Quiet now, he warned. It is a 4-day journey to the other side. Let us hope that our presence may go unnoticed. 4 days. She wanted to scream. 4 bloody days. She felt faint, unable to continue, but a reassuring hand grabbed hers, and she looked down to see Merry and Pippin look up at her with concern reflecting in their soft brown eyes. She smiled and allowed them to drag her with them, but she could not seep the panic out of her system. Her eyes were wide and wild as she looked this way and that, jumping at every sound her sensitive ears picked up. They carried on in silence, pausing every now and then to rest. Legolas was not having an easier time than Elendmire, but he was much better at hiding his fears than she was. Mary Sue's unbelievably soft hand had wheedled its way into his, and he was too frightened to pull away from her. He was grateful for the physical contact. It assured him that he was not alone in the darkness, but he could not help but wish it was Elendmire he was holding on to. He thought back to the night of the ball when they had first danced, and he could not help but wonder at the strength he felt vibrate from within her very essence. He knew that was the kind of strength he longed to feel again, especially now when there was no natural light to comfort him, but all he got was a soft, feminine hand that had a mighty grip upon his fingers. Elendmire, the only one who had totally captured his heart, was the same one to have broken it. He shook his head. His father had been right. One day, he had said, Legolas would meet his match. Legolas had just laughed it off as if it were nothing of importance, but now he knew how it felt for the ones he had rejected in the past. He finally understood the emotion behind the tears that many females before had cried when he had easily dismissed them, for he had now fallen madly in love, but Elendmire was not his to have. He was angry and felt betrayed, but he had a nagging feeling that he was somehow to blame for all this, and yet, she was the one who apologized, even when it was not absolutely necessary, for he knew in his heart, the anger he had felt was not with her but with himself. And this only made him love her even more and despise himself. He was a fool, such a fool. The tug on his hand shook him out of his thoughts, and he looked down at Mary Sue in question. She merely nodded in Gandalf's direction, who said as if on cue, "I have no memory of this place." They had climbed up a labyrinth of stairwells only to have reached a platform of 3 doorways, and not one looked incredibly friendly. Gandalf perched himself on the top step while others made refuge under a part of the stairwell that opened into a small balcony. Ellenmeyer sat next to Boromir, who protectively put an arm around her, and she rested her head in the crook where his shoulders met his neck, and he played with her fingers, which she somehow managed to keep impeccably clean throughout their journey. The perks of being half-elven, she thought idly, studying the dirt that covered his hands. Boromir took this opportune moment to quietly inform the rest of the fellowship of their engagement, which brought smiles across the half-circle that they had formed, taking their minds off of their journey for a while, and Merry and Pippin were the first to jump up and squeal quietly that Boromir had better take good care of their elven friend, for he would have to answer to them if he didn't. This brought a round of light chuckles, and Legolas smirked at the idea. He'd have to deal with me first, he thought viciously, wanting to rip Boromir's arm away from her shoulders, and he suppressed his inner assassin from taking control and killing the man of Gondor. It will be a long engagement, of course, Boromir whispered quietly, smiling sadly as he kissed Ellenmeyer's cheek. The others nodded in understanding, their thoughts returning to the journey at hand. Time passed slowly as they waited for Gandalf to make a decision, but he was still perched upon his step with his pipe in hand, and the area was soon covered with smoke, which Ellenmeyer crinkled her nose at. "Are we lost?" Pippin whispered, his voice sound much louder with no noise about them. "No," Merry scolded impatiently, taking a puff from his pipe. "I think we are." "Shish," Gandalf's thinking. "Merry, what?" "I'm hungry," Pippin whined softly, his stomach grumbling in agreement, and Ellenmeyer wished she had something to feed the poor hungry hobbit. She was quite relieved once again that although she was half-elven, she could endure long hours, even days, without food, but she gave the Took a small smile, praying that they find a way out of the dank mines and return to the blessed realms of sunlight. "Ah, it is that way." Gandalf's voice called out to them, and he pointed excitedly to the one on the right. "He's remembered," Merry cried out, getting up enthusiastically. "No, but the air does not smell so foul down here," Gandalf chuckled as they gathered their belongings and joined the wizard at the door. "If in doubt, Meriadoc, always follow your nose." They followed the staircase steadily upward for hours upon hours, and when Ellenmeyer thought they would never stop, it opened into a large, wide cavern with high columns and pillars holding a vast roof over their heads. It was great hall, and its black walls glimmered and shone like long-forgotten jewels when Gandalf whispered, "Let me risk a little more light." Her eyes widened and her mouth fell completely open. Never before had she deemed dwarves artistic enough to create a place of such beauty that it could rival the dwellings of the elves. She shot a look of appreciation toward the dwarf of the fellowship, and he as well was overcome with awe. "Behold," the wizard exclaimed, "the great realm of the dwarf city of Dwarrodolf. There's an eye-opener, make no mistake." Sam gasped, as wide-eyed as the rest of the company. They continued walking quietly through, twisting their heads this way and that to take in as much of their surroundings as they could. Suddenly, Gimli broke into a full run, letting out a cry of surprise as he darted into an open doorway, and visible from where they had stood, a ray of light shone on, a tomb. The company rushed to catch up with the dwarf, but as they entered the eerily lit room, Gimli was at the foot of the tomb, his head bowed as he sobbed. "Here lies Balin, son of Fundin, Lord of Moria," Gandalf carefully read the inscription on its surface. "He is dead then." Boromir moved to Gimli's side, and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, which Gimli acknowledged with a slight nod, but he could not cease his tears. Gandalf removed his hat and handed it along with his staff to Pippin, who stood closest to him, as he picked up a thick book from the arms of a skeleton which lay resting on the tomb's side. "We must move on," Legolas whispered urgently to Aragorn. "We cannot linger." His hands twitched slightly as he gripped onto his bow, and he looked over at Ellenmeyer, who bit her lip in fear and anxiety. He had to do something, to wipe that expression away, and moved to her, ignoring the look of disbelief on Mary Sue's face as he gently squeezed Ellenmeyer's hand in reassurance. He whispered to her in Elvish, "I am sorry." A look of confusion covered her face as she also responded in their language. "Why?" But he could not answer, for Gandalf had begun to speak, finding the final entry in the large volume. "They have taken the bridge, and the second hall," he read from it. "We have barred the gates, but cannot hold them for long. The ground shakes. Drums, drums in the deep. We cannot get out. A shadow moves in the dark. We cannot get out. They are coming." Ellenmeyer shuddered at the words, for they chilled her down to her bones, but Legolas moved away from her as Boromir turned to look for her. However, Everyone froze, for there, by a well, was Pippin, who had accidentally knocked a fully clad skeleton down it, and the sound reverberated throughout the room and seemed to echo throughout the entire mine itself. With each loud bang, the tension in the room increased, and then silence. Frozen to their spots, they waited for any signs that they were heard, but as the silence sustained for a few more seconds, they all let out a slow, collective breath. Exhaling, everyone save Ellenmeyer glared at the shaken Took, and Gandalf snatched his hat and staff from the poor hobbit. Fool of a Took, he growled. Throw yourself in next time and rid us of your stupidity. They turned to leave, but another sound greeted them, and this time they knew they would not leave without a fight. Doom, boom, doom, boom. Mary Sue gasped loudly at the sound and all eyes fled to Frodo's now shining sword, Sting. Boom, doom, boom, doom. Orcs. Legolas hissed, and Boromir rushed to the door but was thrust back as two arrows nearly sliced through his head. Doom, boom, doom, boom. Boromir. Ellenmeyer cried out, wanting to rush to his side, but seeing that he was uninjured, she stayed close to the hobbits, especially Pippin, who could not stop the trembling that had overtaken his body. They have a cave troll. Boromir groaned as he and Aragorn barraged the door shut with the extra axes lying on the floor near the dead bodies, and everyone took their positions, weapons in hand. Let them come. Gimli growled angrily, his eyes flashing red with anger. There's one dwarf yet in Moria who still draws blood. Ellenmeyer, too, uncovered her sword, and whispered a soft prayer to the Valar to give her strength. The loud banging had now reached the door, and she smiled slightly. With all the anger and frustration building within herself for the past several weeks, she was itching to get back to fighting, and her smile grew ever wider, knowing that these orcs had no idea who they were about to deal with. The familiar warrior spirit within her soul came alive as an axe sliced through the door, and almost instantly, Legolas released an arrow through the narrow slit with such precision that the intruder fell dead before it had another chance to break down the door. Mary Sue had found her way to Ellenmeyer's side, and she was holding her sword the way Ellenmeyer had taught her, and she looked to her teacher with fear written plainly across her face. Just remember what I had taught you, the she-elf instructed before the door had come crashing down from all the pressure of the gathering band of orcs. Trust in yourself, Mary Sue, but do not underestimate your enemy. Do not be afraid. The girl nodded as the orcs swarmed through the room, and Ellenmeyer ran charging, her sword swinging, and with one attack, she cleanly sliced through three black backs, and they fell down behind her with a satisfying thump. Another charged at her, with his arms raised high carrying an axe, but she quickly sliced across its neck. Its head fell off and black ooze splattered across her tunic, and she frowned slightly. Stupid, idiotic creature, she muttered, twirling out of the way as one aimed an arrow in her direction, narrowly missing her heart. She was about to do a vertical chop to cut the thing in half, but an arrow suddenly protruded through its back to its chest and it fell down, revealing a grim-faced Legolas standing behind him. He nodded in her direction, mouthing, "A mean melee," to her before he quickly began attacking more of the villains that had come streaming through to door. The company as a whole was staying alive while successfully killing the orcs that continued on harassing them, and the numbers of the enemy were dwindling, but a huge grunt and the sound of crushed rock forced Ellenmeyer to gaze at the huge, gray, ugly cave troll that had now entered the room. Never in her life had she seen a creature so hideous, but she felt her eyes grow wide with fear when she saw it swing its angry arms one way and then the other, killing multiple orcs in an attempt to grab Gimli. Though stout and a bit heavy, the dwarf managed to dodge the troll's attacks, and Ellenmeyer moved to help him, slicing at the troll's arm with her blade. It growled as it focused its attention on the she-elf, forgetting about the dwarf, but she was quick and easily moved away when it tried desperately to grab her. Arrows were shot at the back of its head, and it swerved around, finding Legolas standing on a ledge, and it began to swing its chain at its new target, but Legolas easily avoided being hit. The chain caught around a pillar, and the elf used this to his advantage, running up the chain and balancing himself on the beast's shoulders as he shot another arrow directly at the troll's head. He leapt off before it could grab him, and the troll focused on creatures who seemed more vulnerable than the warrior elves and dwarf. He had found the hobbits. Merry, Pippin and Frodo had managed to stick together while Sam was on the main floor knocking orcs unconscious with his kitchenware, but now they stood immobile at the sight of the troll and did not know what to do. The troll rammed his weapon between Merry, Pippin, and Frodo, isolating the latter into a tiny corner, and Ellenmeyer fought her way through 5 more orcs in an attempt to keep the troll away from the Fellowship's most important member, but the more she killed, the more attacked her, and she was unable to reach the hobbit in time. Aragorn had found his way to Frodo's side and, grabbing a spear, he thrust it deep into the troll's chest, and it groaned in agony before sweeping Aragorn away, flinging him against the wall, where he lay motionless. Aragorn, Ellenmeyer cried out, her heart beating wildly with fury. No, you demon. Without another thought, she sliced her way through 10 more orcs. I made a promise to Arwen, she thought angrily, and I do not intend to see it broken by an ugly troll. There were no more orcs for her to attack, and she crossed the room to reach Frodo, but it was too late. The troll had taken the spear that Aragorn had used and stabbed the tiny hobbit in his side. Frodo! Sam cried beside the she-elf. She had not been aware of his presence, but now, she could feel his body shaking with sobs. Tears sprang to her own eyes, but she kept them at bay, breathing heavily. She felt her insides begin to constrict then expand, and she was suddenly aware of a light that began to glow from inside of her. Her eyes flashed dangerously, and she let out a tortured cry, raising her sword high above her head as she began to swing in one fluid motion at the troll's arms and legs, and she became a golden blur at its feet, too fast for it to detect where its attacker was coming from. Merry and Pippin had jumped onto its shoulders and were stabbing madly into its back, and Gandalf and Gimli were each taking turns in stabbing the creature from the front. Mary Sue was at Frodo's side, unable to move from the spot as she studied his still figure, and tears were streaming down her face. Boromir was with Sam as they fought off the last of the orcs, and Aragorn was slowly coming to. Legolas finally joined the fray against the troll, aiming his arrow for its high forehead, and with one snap, he had hit his target. The troll slowed its movements, swaying unsteadily from left to right until it fell face first to the ground. They all glared hatefully at the creature before rushing to Frodo's side. Aragorn was the first to reach him, and he gently pushed Mary Sue away as he turned the hobbit over off the spear. He was breathing. Frodo was alive, but how was that possible? I'm all right, Frodo managed to say as he sat up. I'm not hurt. You should be dead, Aragorn gasped, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. That spear would have skewered a wild boar. I think there is more to this hobbit than meets the eye, Gandalf said, his eyes twinkling with mischief as Frodo unbuttoned the top of his shirt, revealing a silvery mail of metal. Mithril, Gimli exclaimed. You are full of surprises, Master Baggins. Shrieks and screams drifted into the room, and Gandalf groaned. Shadows were growing closer and closer and they followed the wizard out of the room. To the bridge of Khazad-dûm, he ordered. They fled out into the large hall that they had first walked into, and black creatures were crawling everywhere from out of the crevices in the ceiling and from the cracks in the floor. There were so many goblins and orcs that they began to blend together in one black wave that was threatening to consume their tiny party of 11. Gandalf paused ahead of them, seeing that their way was blocked, and they each turned around in all directions but they were completely surrounded. Ugly, mutilated faces glared and sneered at them, and they drew closer, as if closing in on their prey. A large growl echoed through the hall, growing louder and more tangible. The motley crew of goblins and orcs trembled and cowered at the sound, slowly easing away from the fellowship, and Ellenmeyer wondered what in the world could scare a huge army like the one that had congregated around them. She looked to Gandalf who had his head bowed, as if trying to deny what he knew. The menacing presence drew closer, and she studied the flashes of red and orange light dancing on the walls, as if it were engulfed in flame. What is this new devilry? She heard Boromir utter. A Balrog, Gandalf sighed heavily, leaning on his staff for support. A demon of the ancient world. This foe is beyond any of you. Run. She gasped at the information but she fled along beside the wizard, running through the doorway that stood at the end of the hallway. It led down a stairwell which had a huge piece missing in its middle. Legolas jumped across the fissure first and cried for Gandalf to follow him, which he did with ease. The gap was not huge, but what lay beneath was a far drop to what seemed like a molten lava pit, and that made the seemingly easy jump all the more terrifying. Ellenmeyer grabbed a hold of Pippin as Boromir grabbed a hold of Merry, and they jumped together. The combined weight off all of them caused about 3 more stairs to fall down into the abyss below, widening the gap. Ellenmeyer's heart was pounding. How were the rest going to get across? An arrow whizzed by her head, and she turned sharply to her right and groaned. Orcs were gathering high above and shooting down at them, but not with the greatest accuracy, and for this, she was thankful. Legolas had begun to fire back as Aragorn tossed Sam across the opening, and she easily caught him. Aragorn reached for Gimli, but he held up a hand in protest. Nobody tosses a dwarf, he scoffed, and he took a leap, his feet just barely making contact, and Legolas reached out and grabbed the only thing that he could to pull his friend to safety, his beard. Not the beard, he protested, but Legolas ignored him, and grabbed him, catching the dwarf in his arms until he could regain his balance. Now all that remained were Aragorn, Frodo and Mary Sue. Several more stairs had fallen from the stairwell, and the Balrog was slowly at their heels. Its loud snarl echoed to them, and its heavy approach could be felt as if an earthquake had ensued each of its steps. There was a loud crack, and a part of an arch of the ceiling came tumbling down just behind where the remaining members of the company stood, and it broke their section free from the stairwell. If they leaned to either side, they would lose the 3 of them in a heartbeat, and they could not let that happen for they were the 3 of the most important ones, the Ringbearer, the rightful king of Gondor, and the prophesized one. Aragorn and Frodo, O holy Valar, save them. Ellenmeyer silently prayed, her heart fluttering with alarm. She held her breath as their section teetered, and she could hear Aragorn call out, "Lean forward." To her amazement, they were suddenly coming towards them, and she opened her arms, as it made contact with their part of the stairwell, and Aragorn fell to her, as Frodo did to Boromir and Merry Sue to Legolas. A smile spread across her face as the top section slipped away, and they continued down to the stairwell to level ground without any more trouble, though they could feel the heat of the Balrog just behind them. When she turned her head for a moment, she was struck down with horror at the enormity of the evil creature. It was huge and completely engulfed in flames, and she forced her legs to carry her as far as they could, just as long as she never had to face the horrible creature ever again. They spotted the bridge just in front of them, and she ushered the hobbits and Merry Sue ahead of her before she slipped across the narrow path of the bridge herself, and as she turned around, Aragorn, Boromir, and Legolas followed respectively. They reached the other side safely, but Gandalf stood still in the middle of the bridge, his staff and Glamdring in his hand. "You cannot pass," Gandalf screamed, his rage building a strange light around him. The Balrog lifted out a sword of fire and chopped it down against the wizard, and Ellenmire's jaw dropped in amazement as the wizard remained unscathed. "Gandalf!" Frodo cried and ran forward, but Ellenmire grabbed him and held him back. There was no way he would be of any help if he interfered, and she herself had to stifle her own urge to run down there and grab the wizard to safety. She held her breath, unable to tear her gaze away from the sight before her, despite the fact that it frightened her to no end. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor." The wizard growled. "The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udin." The Balrog cracked his whip threateningly and took a step forward. "Go back to the shadow. You shall not pass." Gandalf slammed his staff to the ground, sending a force of white light in the direction of the dark creature, and it flinchingly stepped away. It growled again before venturing forward, but the bridge gave away under its feet, taking it into the bleak chasm below. Elation rose in Ellenmire's chest, and she also felt a relaxation in the Frodo's body as she held onto him. Gandalf was still alive, and the Balrog had fallen. The wizard breathed a sigh of relief and turned to join the company, but suddenly, there was another loud crack of a whip, and its fiery fingers wound its way around the wizard's feet, dragging him along. His arms caught the edge of the remaining bridge, and Frodo struggled against Ellenmire's hold to come to his dearest friend's aid. "Gandalf!" He half shouted, half cried, kicking his feet into the air as Ellenmire picked him up and moved to the exit. "Fly, you fools!" Gandalf muttered, his eyes wide but determined, and he relinquished his hold, falling into the obscurity of the chasm. It took another second before they all reacted again, and in her shock, Ellenmire lost her grip on the ringbearer, but he ran directly into Boromir's arms, who picked him up. "No," the hobbit sputtered, desperately trying to free himself. "Gandalf! No, Gandalf!" Boromir ran past Ellenmire as she stood frozen, her eyes never leaving the dark abyss, but Boromir caught hold of her hand, practically dragging her out through the door that brought them out into the world of light. Aragorn had slowly come out after them, his eyes closed as he tried to steady his breathing. Boromir, struggling with his tears of grief, held Gimli tight. The dwarf was ready to go back and fight all of the demons of Moria if the man of Gondor had not had his hold on him. The hobbits lay huddled on the floor with Merry Sue, their sobs full of misery, and Ellenmire. She fell to the ground, tears dripping down her cheeks as she curled into a ball. She was brought back again to the time in her childhood when she had first heard the news of her mother's capture. The same hurt and confusion were raging in a storm deep inside her soul, and her heart felt weak, as if it were growing fainter. She rocked back and forth, trying to deny what she had seen, but she knew he was gone. Gandalf, her longtime friend and advisor, had fallen into the shadow, and the raw pain gnawed at her insides, and she gasped for air. This was the worst she had ever felt, and she looked down at her hands. They were losing their color, and she felt herself growing pale. She was cold, so cold. She closed her eyes, wishing everything to be the way it used to be, but she knew that when she opened her eyes, Gandalf would not be there to greet her with his knowing smile. She knew when she opened her eyes, she would be alone in her tightly curled ball trying to fight off the misery she was feeling, and she shook her head violently. "This is not happening, this is not happening, this is not happening, this is not happening." The mantra repeated itself over and over in her head, and in an instant she stopped moving, but not on her own account. Warmth wrapped around her, and she opened her tear-filled eyes in surprise, and she whispered one word before she collapsed, falling into the arms of the one who loved her. Legolas. Little did they all know how close she was to dying at that very moment.